Hello, and welcome back to NightSleepWhisper. I'm so glad you've joined me tonight. Before we begin, I want you to find your most comfortable position. Let your shoulders drop, release the tension in your jaw, and take a deep breath in and out. Tonight, we are leaving the surface world behind. We are traveling 5,000 meters down, to the crushing silence of the abyss. This is the complete, 50-chapter saga of Deep Station 7. A story of a mysterious golden box, a hidden history, and the shadows that live where the light cannot reach. Close your eyes, and let the weight of the ocean carry you into a deep, restful sleep. Let's dive in. The small submarine moved slowly through the dark water. Inside, the air was cool and smelled like clean metal. Paul sat in a small seat near the front window. He was a safety expert. His job was to check the machines and the doors of deep-sea buildings. He was a tall man with grey hair and very calm eyes. He liked his job, but the ocean was always a little scary. Outside the thick glass, the light from the sun disappeared. First, the water was a bright blue. Then, it became a dark, heavy purple. Finally, everything was black. Paul looked at the control panel. Many small lights flashed. There was a green light for the air and a yellow light for the engine. How much longer? Paul asked. The pilot of the submarine was a woman named Elena. She was an experienced diver. She did not look away from the controls. "We are very deep now, Paul," she answered. "The pressure is very high. We will reach Deep Station 7 in 10 minutes. Paul looked at his notebook. He had a list of things to check. He wanted to see the air tanks and the heavy metal hatches. Deep Station 7 was the newest research station on the ocean floor. It was a place for scientists to study rare fish and old rocks. But Paul was there for safety. He knew that the ocean was dangerous. If a small window broke, the water would come in very fast. Suddenly, a large light appeared in the distance. It was not a fish. It was a bright, white light from a building. "There it is," Elena said. She pointed at the window. Deep Station 7 looked like a collection of giant metal bubbles. It sat on the sandy floor of the ocean. There were long tunnels between the bubbles. It looked like a city from a science fiction movie. Paul saw several large windows. Behind the glass, he saw people walking. They were all adults. They wore blue uniforms. The submarine moved closer to the station. It moved toward a large metal door at the bottom of the building. This was the submarine bay. Paul felt a small bump as the submarine connected to the station. "We are here," Elena said. She turned off the engine. The soft hum of the machine stopped. Now, the submarine was very quiet. Paul stood up and grabbed his bag. He felt a little heavy. He was miles under the surface of the sea. He was far away from the sun and the wind. He took a deep breath and waited for the door to open. He did not know that this trip would be the most dangerous job of his life. He was ready to check the locks, but he was not ready for a mystery. The heavy metal door of the submarine opened with a long, slow movement. Paul stepped out of the small craft and into the docking bay of Deep Station 7. The air here felt different. It was very dry, and it had a faint smell of burnt dust and cold salt. He took a deep breath. A man stood in the center of the room. He wore a dark blue uniform with a silver badge on his chest. He looked about 50 years old, with a short beard and tired eyes. He held a digital tablet in his hand. "You must be Paul," the man said. He did not smile, but his voice was polite. "I am Captain Miller. I run this station. We were waiting for you." "Nice to meet you, Captain," Paul replied. He shook the man's hand. Miller's grip was very strong. The ride down was quiet. The station looks impressive from the outside. It is even more impressive from the inside, Miller said. Follow me. I will show you the main hub. They walked through a long, narrow tunnel. The floor was made of grey metal grids. Underneath his feet, Paul could see pipes and wires. The walls were curved. Every few meters, there was a thick glass window. Paul stopped for a moment to look out. The water outside was an endless, deep blue. It looked heavy and cold. Occasionally, a small, pale fish with glowing eyes swam past the glass. It was beautiful, but Paul felt a small shiver. If the glass cracked, the ocean would destroy the station in seconds. The glass is 10 inches thick, Captain Miller said, noticing Paul's stare. It can hold the weight of a mountain. You are safe here, for now. They reached the main hub. This was a large, circular room. It was the heart of the station. In the center, there were many computer screens and control panels. Bright lights flashed on the walls, red, green, and blue. Several adults moved around the room. They looked busy and serious. Some were typing on keyboards, and others were looking at maps of the sea floor. This is where we monitor everything, Miller explained. The oxygen levels, the power, and our research data. We are very far from the world above, so we have to be careful. Paul looked around the room. He saw a woman in a white lab coat talking to a man near a large monitor. They seemed to be arguing about something, but their voices were low. The atmosphere in the station was tense. It did not feel like a normal workplace. It felt like everyone was hiding a secret. I will start my safety check tomorrow morning, Paul said. Good. Miller replied. Tonight, you will meet the rest of the team at dinner. We have a lot to talk about. Miller turned and walked toward the control panels. Paul stayed by the window. He watched the dark water. He felt like the ocean was watching him back. The common room was small but very bright. A long metal table stood in the center. There were 4 chairs around it. On the walls, there were pictures of the ocean and several maps. Paul entered the room and saw the crew. They were already sitting down for dinner. Captain Miller stood up and pointed to an empty chair. Please, Paul, sit down. The captain said, I want you to meet the team. These are the people who live and work at Deep Station 7. Paul sat down. He looked at the 3 people across from him. To his left was a man with thin glasses and a very white lab coat. He looked very serious. This is Dr. Aries, Captain Miller said. He is our biologist. He studies the strange creatures that live in the dark water. Dr. Aries nodded his head. He did not smile. The ocean is full of secrets, he said in a quiet voice. We must respect it. I spend most of my time in the laboratory. Next to the doctor was a woman with short, dark hair and sharp eyes. She wore a green jumpsuit. She was looking at a small piece of rock on the table. This is Sarah, Miller continued. She is a geologist. She studies the ground under the sea. She looks for rare minerals and old stones. Sarah looked up and gave Paul a small, tired smile. It is a difficult job, she said. The pressure down here makes everything harder, but the rocks tell a story. Finally, Paul looked at the third person. He was a large man with very big hands. His clothes were a bit dirty with oil and grease. He looked very strong. And this is David, the captain said. He is our mechanic. He is the most important man here. He keeps the air flowing and the lights burning. Without David, the station would stop working. David reached out and shook Paul's hand. His grip was like iron. I fix things, David said simply. Usually, the machines break because of the cold. It is a constant battle against the water. The meal began. They ate simple food from cans. For a long time, No one spoke. The only sound was the low, constant hum of the station's engines. It was a heavy sound that never stopped. Paul felt the vibration in his feet. "Are there any problems I should know about?" Paul asked. He wanted to start his safety report. The crew looked at each other. There was a long silence. Dr. Aries put down his fork. Sarah looked at the floor. David stared at his plate. "The station is old," David said finally. "The metal is tired. We hear strange noises at night. The walls groan under the weight of the ocean." "It is just the pressure, David," Captain Miller said quickly. His voice was a bit too loud. "Everything is fine. Paul is here to help us." Paul noticed that Dr. Aries was watching him closely. The doctor's eyes were cold behind his glasses. Paul felt that the crew was not telling him everything. They were hiding something behind their quiet words. Paul followed Captain Miller and Dr. Aries to the station's main laboratory. The door slid open with a soft movement. The lab was the cleanest room in the station. It had white walls and many glass cabinets. Inside the cabinets, there were jars of strange fish and pieces of green rock. In the middle of the room, a large metal table stood under a bright light. "We wanted to show you this," Dr. Aries said. He sounded excited for the first time. On the table sat a heavy black case. Sarah and David were already there. They stood around the table and looked at the case. Captain Miller reached out and opened the latches. He lifted the lid slowly. Inside the case, resting on soft grey foam, was a box. It was about the size of a large book. It was made of a metal that looked like gold, but it was much brighter. The light from the ceiling reflected off its surface. It was beautiful, but it also looked very old. "We found it yesterday," Sarah explained. Her voice was a whisper. The remote robot was exploring a deep canyon 2 miles away. The robot saw something shining in the sand. It picked this up and brought it back. Paul stepped closer. He did not touch it, but he looked at the sides of the box. There were strange drawings on the metal. They were not words. They looked like stars and wavy lines. The lines were very deep and perfect. "Is it solid gold?" Paul asked. "It is much heavier than gold," Dr. Aries answered. "And it is very cold. We brought it inside 24 hours ago. But the metal is still like ice. We cannot open it. There are no hinges and no keyholes." David, the mechanic, shook his head. "I tried to use a small drill on the corner. The drill bit broke. This metal is stronger than anything I have ever seen. It is not from a ship. It is not from any country I know." Paul felt a strange feeling in his chest. He was a safety expert, but he knew this object was a problem. A box this valuable was dangerous. In a place as isolated as Deep Station 7, greed could be as deadly as the water pressure. Paul looked at the crew. They were all staring at the gold. Their eyes were wide and bright. "Why are you telling me this?" Paul asked. "I am here to check the doors and the air tanks." Captain Miller looked at him. His face was very serious. "Because this box is now the most important thing on the station. I need you to make sure the laboratory door is the strongest door in the building. I need to know that this box is safe." Paul looked at the golden box again. It sat on the table, silent and mysterious. The blue light of the lab made the stars on the box seem to move. Paul knew that their quiet life under the sea was about to change. The next morning, Paul went back to the laboratory. He wanted to start his security check. The room was quiet, but Dr. Aries was already there. The doctor sat at a small desk. He was looking at a computer screen with many graphs and numbers. The golden box sat on the center table under a soft blue light. "You are early," Paul said as he entered. Dr. Aries did not look up. "I cannot sleep," he said. This box is the most important discovery in history. I spent the whole night testing the metal. I used lasers and sensors. Do you know what I found? Paul walked to the table. Tell me. The metal is not from Earth. Ares whispered. He finally looked at Paul. His eyes were red from lack of sleep. It is a rare alloy. It is a mix of metals that we do not have in our world. It is incredibly strong and light. If a company had this metal, they could build planes that never break. They could build engines that last forever. Paul looked at the box. It looked simple, but now it felt dangerous. So, it is worth a lot of money. Millions. Ares said. Maybe billions. This is not just a piece of history. It is a fortune. If the world knew we had this, every government and every rich man would want it. We are sitting on a treasure at the bottom of the sea. Paul felt a cold sensation in his stomach. He looked at the heavy laboratory door. It was made of thick steel. The captain asked me to check the security. He is worried. He should be worried. Ares replied. He stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the dark water. Greed is a very powerful thing. We are 5 adults alone in a station. No one can come here. No one can leave. We have the most valuable object in the world in this room. Paul began to check the electronic lock on the door. He opened a small panel and looked at the wires. Everything looked normal. However, he noticed something strange on the floor. Near the leg of the table, there was a small scratch on the metal floor. It looked new. Was this table moved last night? Paul asked. Dr. Ares turned around. No. Why do you ask? There is a scratch here. Paul said. He pointed to the floor. And the table is a little crooked. Ares walked over and looked at the scratch. He frowned. That is strange. I did not move it. Maybe David moved it to check the floor pipes. Paul nodded. But he did not feel better. He finished checking the door. The lock was strong, and the computer system was working. But the atmosphere in the station was changing. The air felt heavy with secrets. He looked at Dr. Ares. The doctor was staring at the box again. Paul realized that the mystery of the box was only the beginning. The real danger was the people inside the station. Paul was walking back to his room when he felt the floor move. It was not a big movement, but it was enough to make him hit the wall. A low, groaning sound came from the metal ceiling. It sounded like a large animal was waking up. Paul hurried to the main hub to see what was happening. Captain Miller was standing in front of a wall of screens. The screens showed red lines and flashing numbers. Sarah was there too. She looked very pale and was holding onto the edge of a desk. What is happening? Paul asked. A storm. Miller answered. He did not look away from the screens. A very big storm is passing over us on the surface. The waves are 30 feet high. The wind is moving the water above us, and we are feeling the energy down here. Paul looked out of the large window in the hub. Usually, the water was still and dark. Now, he could see bubbles and fast movement. Even at this great depth, the ocean was changing. The station shook again. This time, a coffee cup fell off a desk and hit the floor. The ceramic broke into many small pieces. The water pressure is increasing. Sarah said. She was looking at a digital gauge on the wall. The storm is pushing more water into this area. The station is under more weight than usual. I can see the numbers rising fast. Can the station hold? Paul asked. He was thinking about the glass windows and the metal doors. He was the safety expert, and this was his biggest fear. It should. Miller said. But his voice did not sound certain. The station is built for this. But the vibration is the problem. If the station moves too much, the pipes can break or the wires can pull apart. Suddenly, a very loud sound echoed through the room. It was the sound of metal stretching under a heavy weight. Paul felt the vibration in his feet. The lights on the ceiling flickered once, twice, and then stayed dim. The bright white light was gone. Now, the room was filled with a pale, nervous orange light from the emergency system. The main power is struggling. David's voice came over the speaker system. He was in the engine room. I'm trying to balance the system, but the vibrations are making the generator move too much. It is dangerous down here. Paul looked at a small monitor that showed the laboratory. The golden box was still there, sitting quietly on the table. In the orange light, the box looked like it was glowing. The storm was a major problem, but Paul felt that the storm was also a distraction. Everyone was looking at the ceiling and the windows. No one was watching the doors. The station gave another loud groan. The floor tilted slightly to the right. Paul had to hold onto a metal rail to stay standing. The ocean was showing its power, and for the first time, Paul felt very small. The storm continued to shake the station. Paul stood near the window in the main hub. He held onto a metal handle. The emergency orange lights made everything look strange. Sarah was still looking out of the thick glass. Her face was very close to the window. She did not move. She looked like she was seeing a ghost. "Sarah, are you okay?" Paul asked. He walked slowly toward her. The floor was still tilting slightly. Sarah did not answer immediately. She pointed a shaking finger at the dark water outside. "Paul, look at that. Behind the research light. Do you see it?" Paul looked where she was pointing. Beyond the station, a large white light shone into the deep ocean. Usually, this light showed only sand and a few rocks. But now, something else was there. In the distance, a very large and very dark shadow moved. It was not a fish. It was much bigger than a whale. It moved slowly and smoothly through the water. "Is it a submarine?" Paul asked. His heart began to beat faster. "I don't know." Sarah whispered. "It is too dark to see the shape. But it is not moving like the water. It is moving against the current. It is coming closer to the station." Captain Miller walked over to the window. He looked out at the shadow. He narrowed his eyes. He looked worried, but he also looked angry. He stayed silent for a long time. The station made a loud, groaning noise as a large wave of energy hit the walls. "Captain, what is that?" Paul asked. "Is it a rescue ship? Did you call for help?" "No," Miller said. His voice was low and hard. "I did not call for help. And that is not a rescue ship. A rescue ship would turn on its lights. That thing is hiding in the dark." The dark shape moved into the path of the station's light for a second. Paul saw a glimpse of metal. It was not shiny gold like the box. It was a dull, dark gray. It had no windows and no markings. It looked like a giant metal egg. Then, the shape moved back into the darkness. It was gone. "Maybe it is part of the storm," Sarah suggested. She wanted to believe it was something natural. "Maybe it is just a large piece of debris from the surface." "No," Paul said. He was a safety expert. He knew how things moved in the water. "That thing has an engine. It was controlling its direction. It was watching us." Suddenly, the station's radio made a static noise. It was not a voice. It was a rhythmic, pulsing sound. It sounded like a heartbeat. Then, the sound stopped. The station became very quiet again. The only sound was the wind and the water high above them. Paul looked at the captain. Miller was looking at the computer screens. But he was not reading the data. He was thinking. Paul realized that the golden box was not their only mystery. Something was outside in the dark, and it was waiting for the right moment to move. Paul stood in the center of the hub. The orange emergency lights were dim, but he could still see the worried faces of Captain Miller and Sarah. The station was still shaking from the storm above. Every few seconds, the metal walls made a deep, stretching sound. Paul felt the floor vibrate under his boots. He knew the machines were working very hard to keep the water out and the air moving. "David!" Captain Miller shouted into the communication system on the wall. "How is the generator? We need more power for the pressure shields." David's voice came back through the speaker. He sounded tired and very stressed. "The vibration is too much. Captain. The main engine is moving on its base. I am trying to tighten the bolts, but the heat is rising. I don't know if..." Suddenly, David's voice stopped. A very loud, grinding noise came from deep inside the station. It sounded like two giant pieces of metal were rubbing together. Then, there was a sudden, heavy stop. The constant hum of the station, the sound Paul had heard since he arrived, completely disappeared. Everything went black. It was not a normal darkness. It was the absolute, heavy blackness of the deep ocean. There were no windows with moonlight. There were no small lights on the computers. Paul could not see his own hand in front of his face. The silence was even more terrifying than the noise. Without the engines, the station felt like a cold, empty box at the bottom of the sea. "Nobody move," Captain Miller said. His voice sounded different in the dark. It was sharp and full of fear. "I can't see anything," Sarah whispered. Paul heard her breathing quickly. She was panicking. The emergency lights failed. Why did the emergency lights fail? The vibration must have broken the battery cables. Paul said. He tried to keep his voice calm. He was a safety expert. He knew that fear was the biggest danger in a blackout. "Does anyone have a flashlight?" Paul reached into his large pocket. He always carried a small emergency light. He felt the cold metal of the flashlight and pushed the button. A thin beam of white light cut through the darkness. He pointed the light at the floor, then at the faces of his companions. Sarah was holding her head in her hands. Miller was staring at the blank computer screens. "We need to get to the engine room," Paul said. "If the air fans do not start soon, we will have a problem." But Paul was thinking about something else, too. He moved his light toward the hallway that led to the laboratory. In the total darkness, anyone could be moving through the station. The golden box was in a room with an electronic lock. If the power was out, was the lock still working? He looked at Captain Miller. "Captain, the lab. Is the door locked when the power is off?" Miller looked at him, his eyes wide in the flashlight's beam. "The lock is electronic. Without power, the door stays closed, but it can be opened with a manual key. And there are only two keys." A cold feeling moved down Paul's back. In the silence of the blackout, he realized that the shadow outside and the treasure inside were now a deadly combination. Paul held the flashlight tightly. The small beam of light moved across the dark walls of the hallway. Behind him, he heard the heavy footsteps of Captain Miller and the quick, light steps of Sarah. The station felt like a tomb. Without the sound of the engines, Paul could hear every small noise. He heard the water pressing against the metal. He heard his own heart. "The laboratory is just ahead," Captain Miller whispered. They reached the heavy steel door. Paul pointed his light at the electronic panel. The small screen was black. There was no power. Paul tried to pull the handle, but the door did not move. It was locked tight. "Where is the manual key?" Paul asked. "I have one," Miller said. He pulled a heavy metal key from his belt. He put it into a small hole near the floor and turned it. The door made a long, grinding sound as the internal bars moved. Paul pushed the door open. The laboratory was very cold. The air smelled like ozone and old metal. Paul moved his flashlight around the room. He saw the glass jars on the shelves. He saw the computers. Finally, he pointed the light at the center of the room. The large metal table was there, but the table was empty. The black case was open on the floor. The gray foam inside was empty. The golden box, with its strange stars and cold metal, was gone. No! Sarah cried out. She ran into the room. It can't be gone. We are miles under the sea. Where could it go? Paul looked around the room. He saw Dr. Aries sitting in a corner. The doctor was holding his head in his hands. He looked very confused. Paul ran to him and put a hand on his shoulder. Doctor! What happened? Paul asked loudly. Dr. Aries looked up. His eyes were wide and full of fear. The lights went out. He said in a shaky voice, "I was standing near the table. I heard a movement. Then, something hit me on the back of my head. When I woke up a minute ago, the room was dark and the box was gone. Suddenly, the ceiling lights began to flicker. A soft, humming sound started in the walls. The emergency power was coming back. After a few seconds, the room was filled with the dim orange light again. The light showed the empty table clearly. It showed the open case on the floor. And it showed something else. Near the back of the laboratory, there was a small air vent. The metal grill was lying on the floor. It had been unscrewed from the wall. Someone used the vents. Paul said. He walked to the opening. But these vents are very small. Only a very thin adult could fit inside. Captain Miller looked at the empty table. His face was red with anger. We are trapped in a storm at the bottom of the ocean, and we have a thief among us. Paul looked at the open vent. He knew the mystery was becoming more dangerous. The thief was not just fast. They knew the station very well. Paul looked away from the open air vent and looked at Captain Miller. The captain's face was dark and full of worry. The orange emergency light made his skin look pale and gray. Sarah stood by the empty table. She was shaking her head. The silence in the laboratory was heavy. We have to check the submarine bay, Paul said. His voice was firm. If someone took the box, they might try to leave the station. The submarine is our only way out. But the storm is still happening, Sarah said. She pointed at the ceiling. No one can survive a trip to the surface in a small submarine right now. The waves are too dangerous. A thief does not always care about safety. Paul replied. They only care about the treasure. Captain, let's go. They left the laboratory and walked quickly through the narrow hallway. The station was still tilting a little bit to the right. Paul had to touch the wall to keep his balance. They passed the dining room and the sleeping quarters. Everything was quiet. But it was a nervous quiet. Paul kept his flashlight on. The beam of light danced on the metal floor. They reached the end of the long tunnel. In front of them was the giant circular door of the submarine bay. This door was the most important door in the station. It separated the living area from the water and the escape vessels. Captain Miller stepped forward. He put his electronic card against the reader. Usually, a green light appeared and a heavy motor moved the door. But today, the reader stayed black. Nothing happened. The power failure must have reset the security codes, Miller said. He looked frustrated. He grabbed the large manual wheel in the center of the door. He tried to turn it to the left. The metal groaned. But the wheel did not move. Let me help, Paul said. Both men grabbed the wheel. They pulled with all their strength. Their faces turned red from the effort. Paul felt the cold metal against his palms. He pulled until his arms hurt. But the wheel was like a part of the wall. It was completely stuck. It is not just a power problem. Paul whispered. He looked closely at the edges of the door. Look here. He pointed his flashlight at the top of the door frame. A thick metal bar was jammed into the space between the door and the wall. It was a heavy tool from the workshop. Someone had put it there on purpose. Someone locked the door from the inside of the submarine bay. Paul said, "We cannot open it from this side. We are trapped in this part of the station. And David is still in the engine room on the other side of the station." Sarah added. She looked terrified. "We are separated. We have no power, no box, and no way to get to the submarine." Paul looked at the heavy door. He realized the thief was very clever. They did not just want the box. They wanted to make sure no one could follow them. They were miles under the ocean, and now the doors were closing one by one. Paul stood by the jammed door of the submarine bay. He looked at Captain Miller and Sarah. "We cannot stay here," he said firmly. "The thief is inside the station with us. We must gather everyone together right now." They walked back through the narrow, cold hallways to the common room. The orange light was still dim, but it was steady. Dr. Aries was already there, sitting at the long metal table. He looked very pale and was rubbing the back of his head. A few minutes later, David arrived from the opposite direction. The mechanic was covered in black oil and looked exhausted. "I fixed the emergency batteries," David said. He wiped his hands on a dirty cloth. "The lights should stay on now, but the main power is still dead. The storm is making the repairs very difficult." Paul looked at the four adults. He saw fear in Sarah's eyes and anger on the captain's face. Dr. Aries looked confused, and David looked tired. Paul knew he had to take control. "Listen to me," Paul said. "The golden box is gone. The submarine door is locked from the other side. This means the thief wants to trap us here. I am a safety expert, but I also know how to find things. I want everyone to stay here in the common room. I am going to search your bedrooms." Captain Miller stood up. His face was red. "You want to search our private rooms? We are a professional team. This is an insult." "A team with a thief is not a team," Paul replied calmly. "If you have nothing to hide, you will stay here and wait. Sarah, stay with the captain. Dr. Aries, do not move. David, stay by the door and make sure no one leaves." Paul left the common room before anyone could argue. He felt the weight of their eyes on his back. He walked to the sleeping quarters at the end of the hall. There were 5 small rooms in a row. Each room was exactly the same: a small bed, a metal desk, and a closet for clothes. He started with Dr. Aris's room. It was very tidy. There were many books about deep-sea fish and chemistry. Paul looked under the bed and checked the small closet. He opened the desk drawers. He found many papers with notes about the golden box. Aries was clearly obsessed with the discovery, but the box was not there. Next, Paul went into Sarah's room. Her room was different. There were photos of green mountains and bright forests on the walls. She probably missed the world above the water. Paul searched her bags and her closet. He found many small rocks and tools for geology, but nothing suspicious. He moved to the 3rd door. He was looking for a heavy gold box, but he was also looking for secrets. He knew the thief was clever. The box was small enough to hide, but it was heavy. Paul was determined to find it before the air in the station ran out. Paul walked to the 4th door. This was Captain Miller's room. He hesitated for a moment before entering. Miller was the leader of the station, and searching his room felt like a serious act of defiance. However, Paul knew he had to be thorough if he wanted to find the thief. He turned the handle, opened the door, and stepped inside the quiet space. The room was very organized and cold. It felt more like a prison cell than a bedroom. The bed was made perfectly with tight corners. There were no clothes on the floor and no personal items on the shelves. On the small metal desk, there were several thick books about maritime law and the history of the deep sea. A single, small photo of a woman was taped to the wall above the desk. Everything looked normal for a professional man who spent his life at sea. Paul began his search systematically. He looked inside the metal closet. He saw several clean blue uniforms hanging in a neat row. He checked the drawers of the desk, finding only pens, blank maps, and a small logbook. He knelt and looked under the bed, but the floor was empty and clean. He was about to leave when he noticed something strange. The desk was pushed very close to the wall, but there was a small gap between the metal legs and the floor panel. Paul knelt down again. He used his flashlight to look into the dark space. One of the floor panels looked slightly higher than the others. It was not flat. Paul used a small metal tool from his pocket to lift the edge of the panel. It moved easily, as if it were opened often. Underneath the floor, there was a hidden compartment. Inside the space was a black plastic case. Paul pulled it out and opened the lid. It was not the golden box. Instead, it was a high-tech radio. It was small, sleek, and very modern. It was much more advanced than the old, heavy radio in the main hub. Paul noticed that the radio was functional. A small green light was blinking slowly in the center of the device. This was a private radio. It was not connected to the station's main communication system. Paul felt a chill move down his back. Why did the captain need a secret radio? The station already had a communication room for talking to the surface. A private radio meant the captain was talking to someone else. He was talking to someone without the crew's knowledge. Paul thought about the dark, silent shadow he saw in the water earlier. Was the captain communicating with the mysterious submarine? Paul heard a soft footstep in the hallway. He quickly put the radio back into the case and hid it under the floor panel. He pushed the desk back into its original place and stood up. He walked out of the room just as Sarah came around the corner. "Paul? Did you find anything?" she asked. Her voice was thin and full of worry. Paul looked at her. He thought about the blinking green light on the secret radio. He decided not to tell her yet. In this station, secrets were everywhere. He needed to be very careful about who he trusted. "Nothing yet," Paul said quietly. "Let's check the last room." Paul and Sarah walked to the final door in the hallway. This was David's room. Unlike the other rooms, David's space was very messy. There were pieces of metal, old wires, and heavy tools on every surface. The air smelled strongly of oil and old smoke. Paul stepped over a large wrench on the floor and began to search. He looked through the piles of clothes and opened the metal drawers. He found many spare parts for the station's engines, but he did not find the golden box. He checked under the bed and behind the small desk. There was nothing but dust and more tools. David seemed to care only about his work. Paul stood up and wiped his hands on his trousers. He looked at Sarah. She was standing near the door, watching him closely. She looked very nervous. Her hands were moving constantly, pulling at the sleeves of her green jumpsuit. "There is nothing here," Paul said. He walked toward her. "The box is not in the bedrooms. But I have a question for you, Sarah." Sarah looked up. "A question for me? About what?" "About the blackout," Paul said. He kept his voice calm and slow. "When the main power failed, the station became completely dark. I was in the hallway. Captain Miller was near the hub. We reached the center of the station in less than 2 minutes. Dr. Aries was in the lab. But you, Sarah, you arrived at the hub much later." Sarah blinked. She looked at her watch and then at the floor. I told you, Paul. I was in my room. I was very scared. I waited for the lights to come back, but they stayed off. I had to find my way in the dark. Your room is very close to the hub, Paul said. It is only 20 meters away. Why did it take you 10 minutes to reach us? A person can walk that distance in 30 seconds, even in the dark. Sarah's face turned a light shade of red. I told you, I was panicking. I could not find the door. I fell down once. It was very difficult to move. Did you have a flashlight? Paul asked. No, she replied quickly. I didn't. Paul looked down at Sarah's feet. Her boots were clean, but he noticed a very small piece of blue plastic stuck to the side of her left shoe. It was a tiny, bright blue sliver. Paul recognized it. It looked exactly like the plastic seal from the air vent in the laboratory. You were not in your room the whole time, Sarah, Paul said quietly. Were you? Sarah did not answer. She pushed past him and walked out into the hallway. I don't have to listen to this, she said over her shoulder. We are all trapped down here, and you are acting like a policeman. We should be worried about the air, not the time. Paul watched her walk away. He did not follow her. He knew she was lying. The captain had a secret radio, and now Sarah had a secret about the blackout. The mystery was growing, and Paul felt that time was running out for everyone on Deep Station 7. Paul walked away from the sleeping quarters and returned to the main hallway. He wanted to look at the laboratory area one more time. He felt that he had missed something in the dark. The orange light was still dim, and the station continued to groan. The storm was not stopping, and the pressure was high. As he approached the heavy steel door of the lab, he pointed his flashlight at the floor. He moved the light slowly from side to side. Near a large storage cabinet, he saw something dark on the gray metal. It was a long, heavy object. Paul knelt down and picked it up. It was a large metal wrench. It was the kind of tool David used to fix the big pipes in the engine room. The wrench was very heavy and cold. But when Paul touched it, his hand felt damp. He looked at his fingers. They were covered in a clear liquid. He put a small drop of the liquid on his tongue. It was very salty. Seawater, Paul whispered to himself. This was a major problem. The air inside the station was dry. There should be no seawater on the floor, and certainly not on a tool. Seawater inside the station meant there was a leak, or someone had been very close to the ocean. Paul looked at the wrench again. It was not just damp, it was dripping. This tool had been in contact with the ocean very recently. He thought about the jammed submarine door. He thought about the dark shadow outside the window. Had someone actually gone outside? Or was the station starting to break? What are you doing there? A voice asked. Paul jumped slightly. He turned around and saw David standing at the end of the hallway. The mechanic looked even more tired than before. His face was covered in dark grease, and his eyes were red. He was holding a rag and watching Paul closely. I found this wrench, Paul said. He held up the heavy metal tool. It is yours, isn't it? David walked closer and looked at the wrench. He didn't reach for it. Yes, that is my wrench. I was looking for it earlier. I must have dropped it during the blackout. I was running to the engine room to check the pumps. It is covered in seawater, David, Paul said. He watched the mechanic's face for a reaction. Why is your tool wet with salt water? David's expression did not change. He didn't look surprised. The engine room is at the bottom of the station, Paul. During the storm, the vibrations caused a small pipe to spray. It wasn't a big leak, but everything in that corner got wet. I had to use that wrench to tighten the valve. A small leak. Paul asked, "Is the station safe?" "For now," David said. He took the wrench from Paul's hand. His grip was very firm. But the station is old. If the storm gets worse, a small leak can become a big hole. I have a lot of work to do. I suggest you stay in the common room like you told the others." David turned and walked away toward the engine room. Paul watched him go. David's explanation made sense, but Paul didn't completely believe him. The wrench was near the lab, not the engine room, and the water on the wrench was very cold, as cold as the deep ocean. Paul did not go back to the common room. He did not trust David's story about the engine room. He decided to follow his own path. He walked away from the laboratory and toward the back of the station. This area was used for storage. It was a dark and quiet part of the building. Few people came here during the day. The orange light was very weak in the storage hallway. Paul turned on his flashlight again. He moved the light over the metal walls. He noticed that the air felt very cold. It was much colder than the rest of the station. He also heard a very soft, consistent sound. It was the sound of liquid hitting a flat surface. He followed the sound to a small door at the end of the hall. This was storage room B. It was filled with old crates, extra blankets, and dry food. Paul pushed the door open. The smell of salt was very strong here. He moved his flashlight across the floor. In the center of the room, there was a large puddle of water. The water was dark and clear. It was not a small spray from a pipe. It was a steady stream of seawater coming from the wall. Paul walked to the wall and looked closely. A long, thin crack was opening between two large metal plates. The heavy weight of the ocean was pushing the water through the crack. The water was very cold, and it moved quickly across the floor. "This is not a small leak," Paul whispered. He touched the metal plate near the crack. The metal felt like it was vibrating. The storm outside was pushing against the station with incredible power. Every time the station groaned, the crack became a little wider. More water entered the room. The puddle was already touching the bottom of the wooden crates. Paul looked at the ceiling. He saw electrical wires running through the storage room. If the water reached the wires, the whole station could lose power again. Or worse, the water could carry electricity through the metal floor. It was a death trap. He wanted to run and get David, but then he remembered the wet wrench near the laboratory. If David knew about this leak, why did he lie about the engine room? Was David trying to hide the damage, or was he waiting for the station to fail? Paul looked around the room for something to stop the water. He saw a heavy piece of plastic and some strong tape in an open crate. He knew it was only a temporary fix. It would not stop the ocean for long. He worked quickly, pressing the plastic against the cold metal. His hands became numb from the freezing water. As he worked, he realized the truth. The station was dying. Between the thief, the secret radio, and the rising water, they were running out of time. He had to find the golden box and get everyone to the submarine before the ocean broke through the walls. Paul left the storage room. His boots made a wet, heavy sound on the metal floor. He was cold, and his hands were still numb from the freezing seawater. He needed to find out who was moving in the dark during the blackout. He remembered the security cameras. Even when the lights are off, the cameras use special infrared light to see in the dark. He walked to the small security office near the main hub. This room was filled with many small screens and a large computer. Usually, a guard sat here, but the room was empty now. Everyone was either in the common room or working on the engines. Paul sat at the desk and touched the keyboard. The main screen woke up with a soft blue glow. "Let's see what the cameras saw," Paul whispered. He looked for the files from the laboratory camera. He wanted to see the exact moment the golden box disappeared. He found the folder for the current day and scrolled through the hours. He found the time of the blackout. "Wait," Paul said. He leaned closer to the screen. He clicked on the file for the laboratory, but a red message appeared. It said, "File not found." He tried the camera for the submarine bay. The screen showed the same message. File not found. He tried the hallway camera. Again, the file was missing. Paul checked the computer's internal log. This log showed every action the computer performed. He saw that someone had accessed the system only 10 minutes ago. That person used a high-level administrator password. They did not just turn off the cameras. They deleted the memory. They erased every second of the blackout period. Paul felt a heavy weight in his chest. To delete these files, you needed a secret code. Only 3 people in the station had that code: Captain Miller, Dr. Aries, and David. Paul looked at the list of files again. He noticed one very short video at the bottom of the list. It was only 3 seconds long. It was from a small camera near the back of the station, close to the storage rooms. The thief had missed this one. Paul clicked the play button. The video was grainy and dark. It showed a figure walking quickly toward the dark end of the hallway. The person wore a dark uniform with a hood over their head. Their face was completely hidden. But under their arm, they were carrying a heavy, square object. It was the golden box. The video ended suddenly. Just before the screen went black, the person in the hood looked directly at the camera. Their eyes were bright and sharp in the infrared light. Paul did not see a face, but he saw the look of someone who was not afraid. He realized the thief was very smart. They knew how to move in the dark, how to use the vents, and how to use the computer system. This was a professional plan. Paul stood up and looked at the door. He knew the thief was probably watching him now. Paul sat in the cold security office. The blue light from the computer screen made his face look pale. He was still thinking about the 3-second video. He knew that the thief was someone with a high-level password. He decided to look into the personal files of the crew. He needed to know if any of them had a reason to steal. He opened the folder for Dr. Aries. At first, everything looked normal. Aries had a long list of university degrees. He was an expert in deep-sea biology. He had worked at many famous research stations. But then, Paul found a hidden file at the bottom of the list. It was a digital scan of an old newspaper article from 10 years ago. The headline was large and bold: "Scientist fired for selling secrets." Paul read the article carefully. It described a young Dr. Aries working for a very large technology company. The company was building a new type of battery. Aries was caught trying to sell the plans for the battery to a rival company for millions of dollars. He did not go to prison, but he lost his job and his reputation. No one in the world of science wanted to work with him for a long time. "So, the doctor has a history," Paul whispered. He remembered what Aries said in the laboratory. The doctor was obsessed with the golden box. He said it was worth billions. To a man who lost everything because of greed, the box was not just a scientific discovery. It was a second chance to become rich. It was a way to win back the life he lost. Paul thought about the hit on the head. Aries said someone attacked him in the dark. But if Aries was the thief, he could have hit himself or simply lied. He was alone in the lab. He had the password for the computers. He knew the air vents. Suddenly, the door to the security office opened. Paul quickly closed the file on the screen. He turned around and saw Dr. Aries standing in the doorway. The doctor was still holding a cold cloth to the back of his head. He looked tired and very nervous. "What are you doing in here, Paul?" Aries asked. His voice was thin and sharp. "I am looking at the security logs," Paul said. He kept his voice steady. "I'm trying to find out how the files were erased." Aries walked into the room. He looked at the blank computer screen. The thief was clever. They knew our system. "I am a scientist, Paul. I want the box back for the sake of history. I don't care about the security files." Paul looked at the doctor's hands. They were shaking. Was it from the injury, or was it from fear? Paul did not mention the newspaper article. He wanted to keep his knowledge a secret. "The station is in danger, Doctor," Paul said. "We have a leak in the storage room and a thief in our halls. We need to find that box before the storm destroys us all." Aries nodded slowly, but he did not look Paul in the eyes. He turned and walked away. Paul watched him go. He was now certain that everyone on the station had a dark past. The golden box was bringing those secrets to the surface. Paul walked back to the main hub. The orange emergency lights were still dim, making the shadows on the walls look long and strange. He found Sarah standing by the large observation window. She was not moving. She was staring into the dark water with wide, frightened eyes. The station groaned again as the storm above continued to push against the metal walls. "Sarah." "What is it?" Paul asked as he approached her. She did not turn around. She simply raised her hand and pointed. "Look, Paul." It came back. "But it is closer now. Much closer." Paul stepped up to the thick glass. He narrowed his eyes and looked into the darkness. At first, he saw only the pale white sand on the ocean floor. Then, a light appeared. It was a small, blue light moving slowly through the water. It was followed by a second light, and then a third. As the object moved into the station's external floodlights, Paul finally saw it clearly. It was not a large submarine like he first thought. It was a remotely operated vehicle, or an ROV. It was a small, box-shaped machine with 4 powerful propellers and 2 long metal arms. It had no windows because no people were inside it. Someone was controlling it from a distance. "It is a drone," Paul whispered. "A deep-sea drone." The drone moved with perfect control. It swam toward the station and stopped only a few meters away from the glass. One of its metal arms moved up and down. It looked like it was searching for something. Then, the drone turned its bright blue lights directly at Paul and Sarah. For a moment, they were blinded by the glare. "Who is controlling it?" Sarah asked. Her voice was shaking. "There are no other ships nearby. The storm is too big for a boat to stay on the surface." "The person controlling that drone must be very close," Paul replied. "Maybe they are in a larger submarine hiding in the dark. Or maybe—" He stopped. He thought about the secret radio in the captain's room. Suddenly, the drone moved. It swam toward the bottom of the station, disappearing under the floor of the hub. A few seconds later, Paul felt a soft vibration beneath his feet. It was not the vibration of the storm. It was the sound of metal hitting metal. It was a quiet, rhythmic sound, like a hammer hitting a pipe. "It is at the airlock," Paul said. "The drone is trying to connect to the station." "But the airlock is for the crew," Sarah cried. "If that thing opens the door, the water will come in." Paul grabbed the metal railing. He knew the drone was not there to destroy the station. It was there to pick something up. The thief had the golden box, and now the transport was waiting outside. The mystery was no longer just about a missing object. It was a race against a machine from the dark. Paul stood in the hub and tried to take a deep breath. Usually, the air in the station was cold and moved quickly because of the large fans. But now, something was wrong. The air felt still. It was becoming warm and heavy. Paul looked up at the ceiling. The small ribbons of plastic that usually danced in the wind from the vents were hanging perfectly still. "The fans," Sarah whispered. She was wiping sweat from her forehead. "I don't hear the fans anymore." Paul listened. Sarah was right. The low, constant hum of the ventilation system had stopped. In a station deep under the ocean, the air system was the most important machine. It brought in fresh oxygen and removed the bad air that people breathed out. Without the fans, the air would become poisonous very quickly. Paul ran to the main control panel. He pushed several buttons to bring up the life support screen. A large graph appeared. A red line, representing carbon dioxide, was moving up. A blue line, representing oxygen, was moving down. "We are losing our air," Paul said. He looked at the clock on the wall. "At this rate, the air will be too bad to breathe in less than 2 hours. We will become sleepy, and then we will stop breathing." "Why did it stop?" Sarah asked. She was breathing faster now. Her face was turning a light shade of red. Was it the storm? Or the leak? "I don't think so," Paul replied. He looked at the computer code on the side of the screen. The system did not break. Someone turned it off from a different computer. This is more sabotage. Suddenly, the captain walked into the hub. He looked angry and his clothes were messy. "The engine room is a disaster. David says the air scrubbers are locked. He cannot open the manual valves because the electronic system is blocking him." "Captain, the drone is outside at the airlock," Paul said, pointing at the window. "And now the air is failing. The thief is trying to weaken us. They want us to be too tired to fight back." "We need to fix the air first," Miller said. "If we cannot breathe, the golden box does not matter. Paul, go to the engine room and help David. Use your safety tools to break the electronic lock if you have to. I will stay here and try to find where the signal is coming from." Paul nodded. He felt a slight pain in his head. It was the first sign of the bad air. He knew he had to move fast. Every breath he took was using up the little oxygen they had left. He left the hub and began to run toward the engine room. The hallways felt longer and tighter than before. The silence of the station was now a deadly threat. He had to save the crew before the silence became permanent. Paul ran through the long, quiet hallway. His chest felt tight. The air was warm and heavy now. Every breath felt like he was breathing through a thick blanket. He was heading to the engine room to help David, but he realized he needed his heavy metal cutting tool. He had left it in his sleeping quarters. He reached his small room and pushed the door open. The room was dark, but his flashlight showed the small bed and the metal desk. He moved quickly to the closet to find his bag of tools. As he turned toward the bed, the light of his flashlight hit the white pillow. There was a small, square piece of paper lying in the center of the bed. Paul stopped. He knew he had not left any paper there. He walked to the bed and picked it up. The paper was dry and clean. On it, someone had written a message in large, capital letters. The ink was black and thick. "Stop looking, or we all stay down here forever." Paul felt a cold shiver, despite the heat in the room. This was not a joke. The thief was watching him. The thief knew that Paul was searching the rooms and looking at the security files. The message was clear. If Paul did not stop, the thief would make sure the station never returned to the surface. "They are willing to die to keep the box," Paul whispered to the empty room. He put the note in his pocket and grabbed his heavy cutting tool. He did not have time to be afraid. He had to fix the air. He ran out of the room and continued toward the back of the station. He reached the engine room door. It was a massive circular hatch. He pulled the lever and stepped inside. The engine room was a forest of pipes, wires, and giant metal tanks. The heat here was intense. David was standing on a ladder, hitting a large valve with a hammer. The metal made a loud, ringing sound that echoed through the room. "David!" Paul shouted. David looked down. His face was covered in black grease and sweat. He looked like he was about to collapse. "The electronic system is fighting me, Paul. I try to open the oxygen valves, but the computer keeps closing them. It is like a ghost is in the machine." Paul showed him the cutting tool. "We don't need the computer. We are going to cut the wires and open the valves by hand." David climbed down the ladder. He looked at Paul's face and saw the worry in his eyes. "You look like you saw a ghost, Paul. What happened?" Paul reached into his pocket and showed David the note. David read the words slowly. He looked at the paper, then at the heavy door, and finally at Paul. "We are trapped with a monster," David said quietly. He handed the note back. "Let's fix the air. If we don't, the thief wins without even trying." The engine room was like a furnace. The heat from the struggling machinery had no way to escape without the fans, and the air was thick with the smell of hot oil and stagnant breath. Paul felt a sharp, pulsing pain behind his eyes. The first real sign that the carbon dioxide levels were becoming dangerous. "The control box is up there," David shouted over the hissing sound of a steam pipe. He pointed to a small metal cabinet mounted high on the wall, surrounded by a spiderweb of thick cables. "That's the brain of the ventilation system. If we can kill the power to the electronic lock, the manual override should release." Paul climbed the ladder, his movements feeling slow and heavy. Every step required a conscious effort. When he reached the cabinet, he saw a small digital screen glowing a mocking red. It displayed a single word. "Locked. Ready." Paul called down. He gripped his heavy cutting tool. The metal felt cold and solid in his sweaty palms. "Do it." David yelled back. He was standing by a massive red wheel on a pipe that disappeared into the ceiling. He had a long metal bar wedged into the wheel for extra leverage. Paul jammed the nose of the cutting tool into the gap of the control box. He squeezed the handles with all his remaining strength. With a loud crack, the metal door flew open, revealing a mess of colorful wires and circuit boards. Paul didn't bother looking for a switch. He shoved the blades of the tool into the center of the wiring and squeezed again. Bright blue sparks showered the room. The smell of burning plastic filled the air. On the wall, the red locked sign flickered and died. "Now, David. Turn it." Paul screamed. David groaned, his muscles bulging as he threw his entire weight against the metal bar. The red wheel stayed still for a heartbeat, then gave a sharp, metallic ping. Slowly, it began to rotate. As David spun the wheel, a deep, rhythmic thud echoed through the pipes, the sound of the giant fans waking up. Suddenly, a blast of cold, fresh air hit Paul in the face. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever felt. He leaned his forehead against the cool metal of the wall and took long, deep gulps of oxygen. The dizziness in his head began to fade, replaced by a sharp, clear focus. "We did it," David panted from below. He leaned against the pipe, his shirt soaked through with sweat. "The air is moving again." Paul climbed down the ladder, his legs shaking. "It's only a temporary victory, David. The person who locked that system is still out there, and they have the box." He looked at the burnt wires in the control box. The thief had been willing to let everyone suffocate to keep control of the station. As the fresh air filled the room, the silence of the station was replaced by the familiar hum of the fans, but the sound brought no comfort. Paul knew that the thief's next move would be even more desperate. Paul wiped the black grease from his hands with a rag as he walked into the main hub. The air was cool and fresh again, but the atmosphere in the room was freezing. Captain Miller, Dr. Aries, and Sarah were sitting around the central table. They looked like statues, their faces pale under the orange emergency lights. David followed Paul, standing by the door with his arms crossed. "The air is fixed," Paul said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "But the station is still broken. Not the machines, the people." Captain Miller looked up, his eyes narrow. "What is that supposed to mean, Paul?" "We should be planning our escape, not making speeches." "We can't escape the truth," Paul replied. He walked to the center of the table and looked at each of them in turn. "I've spent the last hour looking into every corner of this station. I found things you didn't want me to see." He turned to Sarah first. "You told me you were in your room during the blackout, panicking, but there was a piece of blue plastic from the laboratory's air vent stuck to your boot, and it didn't take you 10 minutes to find your way in the dark. You were busy." Sarah's eyes went wide. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Paul moved his gaze to Dr. Aries. "And you, Doctor? A victim of a hit on the head? Or a man who once lost his career for selling secrets to the highest bidder? You told me this box was worth billions. You've been waiting for a second chance like this for 10 years. Aries turned his head away, his face tightening. Then, Paul looked at David. "The wet wrench. You said it was from a small leak in the engine room, but the engine room is at the back. I found the wrench near the lab. And that water wasn't from a pipe. It was freezing cold seawater." Finally, Paul looked directly at Captain Miller. The room felt like it was losing pressure. "And then there's you, Captain. The man in charge. I found your private radio hidden under the floorboards in your room. It was blinking, Captain. You've been talking to someone outside. Someone in that drone, perhaps." The silence that followed was heavy. The crew looked at each other, the trust that had held them together for months completely shattered. Every person at the table had a secret, and every secret pointed toward the golden box. "I didn't steal it," Miller said quietly, though his voice lacked its usual authority. "The radio, that's for my own safety. This station is a death trap. I needed a way out if things went wrong." "We all wanted a way out," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "But I didn't take the box. I was in the vents, yes. I was trying to see what Aries was doing. I didn't trust him." "Enough." Paul slammed his hand on the table. "While we argue, someone, or something, is at the airlock. The drone is waiting. If we don't find that box in the next 10 minutes, it won't matter who the thief is. We'll all be at the bottom of the ocean for good." The tension in the hub was broken not by a confession, but by a piercing, high-pitched scream from the station's computer. A red light began to spin on the ceiling, casting rhythmic, bloody flashes over the shocked faces of the crew. "Airlock activation!" David shouted, his eyes darting to the secondary monitor. "Someone is cycling the outer door in sub-level 4. Paul didn't wait for the captain's order. He sprinted toward the monitors, his boots skidding on the metal floor. He punched a series of commands into the security bypass. The screen flickered, showing a grainy, black and white feed of the airlock chamber. The room was small and circular. In the center of the floor, sitting alone like a discarded toy, was the golden box. "It's there!" Sarah cried, leaning over Paul's shoulder. "But how?" "No one left this room." "The vents," Paul said, his voice grim. "The thief didn't need to be there. They used the ventilation system like a slide. They must have timed it to drop the box into the airlock chamber before we fixed the fans." On the screen, the heavy outer door of the airlock began to groan open. The dark, pressurized water of the abyss didn't rush in. The airlock was designed to keep the pressure equal, but the mechanical arms of the drone Paul had seen earlier were already reaching into the chamber. The blue lights of the drone illuminated the gold metal, making the strange stars on the box glow with an eerie, white light. "They are taking it!" Dr. Aries yelled, his voice cracking. "Stop the cycle, Paul. Close the door." Paul's fingers flew across the keyboard. "I can't. The manual override has been physically jammed. Someone put a mechanical block on the outer gears." He looked at the crew. Someone who knew exactly how the airlock works. The drone's metal claws closed around the box. It was a precise, practiced movement. As soon as the claws locked, the drone began to pull back into the darkness of the ocean. "If that box leaves the station, we'll never know the truth," Paul said. He grabbed a heavy flashlight and a magnetic tether from the wall. "And we'll never get the evidence we need to find out who the traitor is." "What are you doing?" Captain Miller asked, his voice full of sudden fear. "I'm going into the inner chamber," Paul said, already halfway to the door. "If I can grab the tether before the door closes, I might be able to pull the box back. David, get to the manual controls. If I give the signal, you blow the emergency seal. It'll ruin the airlock, but it'll trap the drone. Paul, that's suicide. Sarah shouted. The pressure is equalized in the chamber, Paul barked back. Just make sure you don't open the inner door while I'm in there. He disappeared into the hallway, his heart hammering against his ribs. He wasn't just chasing a treasure anymore. He was chasing the person who had tried to kill them all by turning off the air. He reached the sub-level 4 hatch and gripped the cold handle. Behind him, the station groaned louder than ever. The storm was reaching its peak, and the ocean was waiting. Paul stepped into the inner chamber of the airlock. The air here was freezing, and the floor was slick with a thin layer of seawater. The heavy inner door hissed shut behind him, locking with a definitive, metallic sound. He was now in the small no-man's land, between the safety of the station and the crushing weight of the Atlantic. Through the thick, reinforced glass of the outer hatch, he saw the drone. Its blue lead eyes were blinding in the darkness. It was already a meter away from the station, the golden box held tightly in its mechanical claws. The tether hummed as the drone's propellers fought against the currents of the storm. David, do you hear me? Paul shouted into his helmet comms. I hear you, Paul. David's voice crackled. The outer door is stuck at 40% open. That tool is wedged deep in the gears. If you're going to do something, do it now. Paul raised the magnetic tether gun. It was a heavy, industrial tool used for securing supply crates in high current zones. He braced his boots against the guide rail on the floor, aimed for the center of the gold metal, and pulled the trigger. The gun kicked against his shoulder with a violent jolt. A high-tension cable hissed out of the barrel, trailing a glowing blue line behind it. The magnetic head slammed into the side of the box. For a second, everything went still. Then, the cable went taut. The drone felt the resistance. Its propellers changed pitch, turning from a low hum to a high-pitched sound. Paul was suddenly jerked forward, his boots sliding across the wet metal. He grabbed the guide rail just before he was pulled through the opening into the black water. It's too strong. Paul yelled. The drone has more horsepower than I have weight. Hold on, Paul. Sarah's voice broke through the comms. I'm looking at the drone's power readings. If you can't pull it back, try to short it out. The tether is a conductor. Paul looked at the winch on his belt. It was vibrating so hard his teeth hurt. He reached for the emergency battery pack on the wall of the airlock, a high-voltage unit meant for emergency welding. He grabbed a pair of jumper cables, his hands shaking. This is going to be messy, Paul muttered. He clipped one lead to the battery and the other to the metal reel of the tether. A massive spark erupted, lighting up the airlock like a flashbulb. The electricity surged down the cable, invisible but deadly. Outside, the drone's lights flickered, its propellers stuttered, and for a glorious moment, it drifted. Paul seized the opportunity. He threw his weight backward, cranking the manual winch with everything he had. The box moved, 10 centimeters, 20, 30. It was coming back. But then, the station gave a massive, agonizing lurch. A giant wave from the storm above had slammed into the structure. The airlock tilted violently. Paul lost his footing, and the jumper cables snapped away from the battery. The drone roared back to life, angrier than before. It surged away from the station, pulling the cable, and Paul, straight toward the jagged edge of the half-open outer door. Paul's boots skidded over the wet metal floor, his heels catching on the guide rail just before he was hauled into the dark, churning water of the Atlantic. The tether cable was stretched so tight it made a high-pitched, singing sound, like a violin string about to snap. David! I'm losing it! Paul screamed into his comms. Kill the outer door power. Now! But the response that came through his headset wasn't David's voice. There was a sudden, violent crash of metal, followed by a grunt of pain and the description of a heavy body hitting the floor. "David! David, answer me!" Paul yelled. Back in the hub, the situation had turned chaotic. David had been reaching for the manual override lever, a massive iron bar that could force the airlock doors shut, when a heavy fire extinguisher swung through the dim orange light. It caught the mechanic squarely in the shoulder, sending him sprawling across the control deck. Paul felt the tension in the cable change. Instead of the steady pull of the drone, the winch on his belt suddenly whirred with lethal speed. The controls had been damaged. The drone was no longer just pulling. It was reeling him in. "Stop!" Sarah's voice shrieked over the comms, followed by the sound of a scuffle. In the airlock, Paul looked through the thick glass. He saw the drone's blue lights flare, but he saw something else, too. Just above the golden box, caught in the drone's mechanical claw, was a small, white object. It looked like a piece of paper or a tag. Paul realized with a jolt of horror that the drone wasn't just a retrieval tool. It was a delivery system. The thief hadn't just been trying to send the box out. They were receiving instructions. "Paul, get out of there." Captain Miller's voice finally broke through the static, sounding breathless and panicked. "The outer door is collapsing. The frame is bending." The pressure of the storm and the force of the drone were too much for the jammed door. The thick steel began to groan, the metal sounding as it twisted like silver foil. If the door buckled, the inner seal of the airlock would be the only thing keeping the entire station from imploding. Paul looked at the golden box, now only inches from the jagged edge of the door. He looked at his hands, raw and bleeding from the cable. He had to make a choice. If he held on, he might be pulled through the gap into a 3-mile-deep grave. If he let go, the secret of Deep Station 7 would vanish into the dark forever. "I'm not letting go," Paul hissed through gritted teeth. He reached for the manual emergency release on his own winch, not to let the cable go, but to lock it. He jammed a metal screwdriver into the gears, turning himself into a human anchor. At that exact moment, the station tilted again, and a shadow moved across the inner glass of the airlock. Someone was standing on the other side of the hatch, watching Paul struggle. They weren't helping. They were waiting for the door to break. The water didn't just leak in, it exploded through the gap. Because they were nearly 3 miles below the surface, the weight of the ocean was immense. This created a pressure of roughly 48 megapascals, nearly 7,000 pounds per square inch. The jet of water hitting the back wall of the airlock sounded like a gunshot. Paul was thrown backward as the small chamber began to fill with terrifying speed. The freezing water was a shock to his system, making his lungs seize. He lost his grip on the guide rail, and for a moment, he was tumbled in the dark, churning whirlpool. Through the chaos, the tether cable remained his only link to reality. It was still locked to his belt, and it was pulling him toward the jagged, broken mouth of the outer door. "Paul, the chamber is flooding. I'm losing your vitals." Sarah's voice was barely audible over the roar of the water in his ears. Paul kicked his legs, fighting the current. He managed to grab the handle of the inner hatch. He looked through the small, thick porthole. The figure was still there, a dark silhouette against the orange emergency light of the hallway. In the flash of his own underwater flashlight, Paul saw a glimpse of a blue uniform sleeve. Critical status. The airlock is 80% flooded. The temperature is dropping to 2 degrees Celsius. The drone, seeing its chance, gave one final, powerful surge. The golden box was pulled halfway through the broken outer door, but the box was too wide to fit through the jagged opening the malfunction had created. It jammed. Paul reached out, his fingers numbing in the cold. He grabbed the corner of the box. He was now the middleman in a deadly game of tug-of-war between a high-tech drone and a failing station. "David, if you can hear me, hit the emergency purge." Paul choked out, swallowing a mouthful of salt water. Suddenly, the figure at the window moved. Instead of hitting the purge button, which would have pumped the water out, the person reached for the lock override. The inner door, the only thing protecting the rest of the station from the flooded airlock, began to vibrate. The traitor wasn't trying to save Paul. They were trying to open the inner door to let the pressure equalize, which would drown Paul instantly and likely collapse the entire sub-level. Paul slammed his fist against the glass. "No!" The door stayed shut for a second, then groaned. The traitor hadn't realized that David's manual bar was still wedged in the hub, partially jamming the electronic command. Paul had a few seconds of life left. He looked at the box, then at the cable. He took his cutting tool and, with a roar of effort, didn't cut the tether, he cut the drone's mechanical claw. The metal arm of the drone snapped. The drone, suddenly light, shot backward into the dark ocean. The golden box fell back into the airlock, sinking to the floor. Paul grabbed the box and huddled against the inner door just as the chamber filled completely. He was out of air, out of heat, and trapped in a tomb of water. Paul's lungs were screaming. The silence of the underwater tomb was absolute, broken only by the muffled, metallic groans of the station as it fought the storm. He squeezed his eyes shut against the sting of the salt water, his hands locked around the golden box. His vision began to narrow, dark spots dancing at the edges of his consciousness. Just as his grip began to fail, the red floodlights in the airlock shifted to a pulsing yellow. A deep, mechanical vibration thrummed through the walls. The drainage pumps, the breath of life for a drowned room, had finally been activated from the hub. The water level began to drop, though it felt agonizingly slow to a man who had been holding his breath for nearly 2 minutes. As the water cleared his mouth and nose, Paul let out a ragged, desperate gasp, coughing and shivering violently. The air in the chamber was freezing, but it was air. Outside the inner porthole, the dark silhouette was gone. "Paul, can you hear me?" Sarah's voice exploded through the comms, high-pitched and frantic. "I've cleared the manual override. I'm opening the hatch." The heavy inner door hissed, but it didn't swing open. It rattled against the frame, held back by the massive pressure difference. "The seal is stuck." David's voice joined in, sounding weak and raspy. "Paul, you have to hit the pressure release valve on your side. It's the red lever near the floor." Paul rolled onto his side, his limbs feeling like lead. He found the lever, buried under a few inches of remaining water, and pulled it with the last of his strength. A violent hiss of equalizing air screamed through the room. Finally, the door swung inward. Paul tumbled out onto the hallway floor, gasping and clutching the box to his chest. Sarah was there instantly, wrapping a thick emergency blanket around his shivering shoulders. David was leaning against the wall nearby, a dark bruise forming on his temple where he had been struck. "The captain." Paul wheezed, salt water stinging his throat. "Where is the captain?" He went to the engine room to check the secondary pumps right after the scuffle. David said, his voice bitter. "He said he didn't see who hit me, but Sarah saw a blue sleeve disappearing around the corner." Paul looked down at the golden box. It was covered in scratches from the drone's claws, but it remained closed, silent, and impossibly cold. He looked back at the airlock. The outer door was a twisted wreck of steel, and they were now one thin inner door away from the Atlantic. "We don't have much time," Paul said, his voice regaining its edge. "The traitor knows I saw them. They aren't just trying to steal the box anymore. They're trying to sink us." He looked at Sarah and David. For the first time, he saw a spark of genuine trust in their eyes, born from the shared terror of the last 10 minutes. But as he looked down the long, orange-lit hallway toward the hub, he knew the captain, and the mystery of the secret radio, was still waiting for them. Paul's teeth were still chattering, a rhythmic clicking sound that echoed in the narrow corridor. The emergency blanket Sarah had wrapped around him felt like a sheet of lead, but he refused to let go of the golden box. It sat heavy and freezing in his lap as he sat on the floor, leaning against the cold metal wall to catch his breath. "You need to get to the med bay, Paul," Sarah said, her voice soft but urgent. "That water was near freezing. If your body temperature doesn't go up, you'll go into shock." "No time for a nap," Paul rasped, shaking his head. He looked at David, who was holding a heavy pipe wrench, his eyes fixed on the shadows at the end of the hall. "The captain is in the engine room. He said he was fixing the pumps, but the pumps were already running when the airlock drained. He lied." "He's been lying since you got here." David spat. He touched the bruise on his head. "I've worked for Miller for 3 years. I thought he was just a hard man. I didn't think he was a murderer." "We don't know that yet," Paul said, though he didn't believe his own words. "But we're going to find out. Help me up." With David and Sarah's help, Paul stood. His legs felt like jelly, but the adrenaline was keeping him upright. They moved slowly toward the back of the station, heading for the heavy vibration of the engine room. As they approached the main door, Paul held up a hand, signaling them to be quiet. The door was slightly ajar. Instead of the description of a hammer or a wrench, a low, rhythmic pulsing sound was coming from inside. It was the same sound Paul had heard on the radio earlier, a heartbeat of static. Paul peered through the gap. The engine room was filled with steam and the orange glow of emergency lights. Captain Miller wasn't at the pump station. He was standing at a secondary maintenance terminal. The small, high-tech radio Paul had seen in his room plugged into the station's main antenna array. "The package is secured." Miller's voice was low, barely audible over the hum of the engines. "The retrieval failed, but the asset is still on board. The station is compromised. Send the recovery team. Use the secondary coordinates." There was a burst of static, then a voice replied, cold, distorted, and definitely not from the Coast Guard. "Understood. Captain. Estimated arrival. 20 minutes. Maintain the lockdown. Do not let the asset leave the hub." Paul felt a surge of cold fury. The asset was the box. The recovery team was whatever was in that dark shadow outside. Miller wasn't just a thief. He was a broker, selling them all out to someone in the dark. 20 minutes. Paul whispered to Sarah and David. "In 20 minutes, whoever is out there is going to come in. And I don't think they're coming to save the crew." "What do we do?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with terror. Paul looked at the golden box in his arms. "We change the plan. If the captain wants a lockdown, we'll give him one. But he's not going to be the one holding the keys." He looked at David and pointed to the main power coupling on the wall. "Can you cut the transmission without Miller knowing?" David grinned, a dark, dangerous look. "I can do better than that. I can make that radio look like a lightning rod." Paul watched from the shadows as David crawled toward the main power coupling. The engine room was a maze of thick, vibrating cables that looked like the veins of a giant beast. Above them, the captain was still hunched over his terminal, his back turned, oblivious to the 3 people standing just meters away. "If I bridge these 2 nodes," David whispered, pointing to a pair of heavy copper terminals, "I can send a massive surge of direct current back through his little radio. It won't just stop the message, it'll fry the hardware." The physics of the power surge was simple but effective. This sudden heat would melt the delicate circuits in an instant. "Do it," Paul commanded. David took a pair of insulated pliers and jammed a thick copper wire between the nodes. A shower of white-hot sparks erupted from the coupling. The sound was like a whip cracking in the small room. At the terminal, Miller's radio gave a pathetic, high-pitched whine. A cloud of acrid black smoke puffed out of the device, followed by a bright blue flash. Miller jumped back with a cry of surprise, his hands flying to his ears as the feedback screeched through his headset. "What?" Miller spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for the heavy flare gun tucked into his belt. "The conversation is over, Captain," Paul said, stepping out of the shadows. He held the golden box firmly in his left arm, his right hand gripping a heavy metal pipe he'd scavenged from the floor. Sarah and David moved to his sides, forming a wall of silent, angry faces. Miller looked at them, then at his ruined radio, then at the box. The hard-man facade he'd worn for years finally cracked. He didn't look like a captain anymore. He looked like a cornered animal. "You don't understand what you're doing," Miller hissed, though his voice was shaking. "That recovery team, they aren't coming to negotiate. They're coming to clean up. If they find you with that box, you're all witnesses they can't afford to leave behind." "And what was your plan, Captain?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling with rage. "To let us drown in the airlock while you sailed away with your recovery team." "I was going to save you," Miller lied, his eyes darting toward the engine room exit. "I just needed to ensure the asset was safe." "Save it for the police," Paul said. "David, tie him up. Use the heavy-duty cable ties. Sarah, get to the hub. We need to find out exactly where that recovery team is coming from." But as David stepped forward to grab the captain, the station gave its most violent lurch yet. A deep, booming sound, like a giant hammer hitting the hull, echoed from the bottom level. The floor tilted a full 15 degrees, sending the golden box sliding across the metal floor. "That wasn't the storm," David said, his face turning pale. "That was the submarine bay. Something just docked." The 20 minutes were up. The sound of the docking clamp was a heavy, metallic clunk that vibrated through the very marrow of Paul's bones. It wasn't the graceful, automated docking of a supply ship. It was a forced, magnetic strike. The station groaned as the massive weight of an external vessel locked onto the submarine bay. "They are here," Miller whispered. His face was a mask of pure terror. "If you want to live, give me that box and let me talk to them. I'm the only one they'll listen to." "Not a chance, Captain," Paul said. He lunged across the tilted floor and grabbed the golden box just as it was about to slide into a pool of oily water. "David, the cables. Secure him now." David didn't hesitate. He used heavy-duty industrial zip ties to lash Miller's wrists to a reinforced coolant pipe. The captain struggled, but he was no match for the mechanic's strength and the group's collective resolve. "Sarah, get to the security monitors," Paul ordered. "We need to see who we're dealing with." They hurried out of the engine room, leaving Miller shouting behind them. When they reached the central hub, Sarah dived for the console. The screens flickered, showing the interior of the submarine bay. The air was thick with white condensation as the pressure equalized. "Look at their gear," David whispered, his voice tight. 3 figures emerged from the hatch. They weren't wearing the bright orange of the Coast Guard or the blue of a research team. They were dressed in charcoal gray tactical suits made of a matte material that seemed to swallow the dim light. Their helmets were smooth, with glowing red visors, and they carried compact, suppressed carbines. "Those aren't rescuers," Sarah breathed. "They are mercenaries." "They are cleaners," Paul corrected. He watched as the lead figure signaled the others. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized efficiency. "They aren't here for the crew," They're here to retrieve the box and ensure no one else knows it exists. One of the mercenaries stopped in front of the camera. He didn't look away or move on. He raised a small device, a high-frequency jammer. The screen exploded into white static. "They know we're watching," Paul said. He looked at the golden box, then at the two people who had become his only allies in the deep. "We can't fight them head-on. Not with those weapons. We have to use the station against them." "How?" Sarah asked. "They already have the codes." "They have the codes, but David has the wrenches," Paul said, looking at the mechanic. "And I know every safety flaw in this building. If they want to play in the dark, we'll give them a dark they'll never forget." A distant thump echoed through the floor, the sound of the inner bay door being blown off its hinges. The boarding party was inside the living quarters. The hunt had begun. The lights in the hub flickered once, then died completely, replaced by the spinning, angry red of the tactical blackout. Paul could hear the mercenaries' boots, a rhythmic, heavy crunch against the metal floor, approaching from the north corridor. They were moving fast, confident in their superior technology. "They're using infrared," Paul whispered, his breath hitching as he pulled Sarah and David into the maintenance sub-crawl space beneath the main console. "Those red visors, they see our body heat like glowing candles in the dark." "Then we're dead," Sarah hissed. "There's nowhere to hide our heat." "Actually, there is," David murmured. He reached for a manual override lever labeled Fire Suppression. "Sector 4. Paul, if I blow the CO2 tanks, the temperature in the hallway drops to nearly minus 78 degrees Celsius in seconds. It'll create a thermal whiteout." Paul nodded. The physics was sound. A sudden release of compressed carbon dioxide would not only displace the oxygen but would cause a massive drop in temperature due to the Joule-Thomson effect. "Wait for my signal," Paul said. He looked at the golden box. It seemed to pulse with a faint, internal light, as if it knew the danger was close. "We need them to be deep in the bottleneck of the hallway." He peered through the floor grate. 3 shadows appeared at the end of the corridor. Their movements were robotic. Their suppressed rifles swept the room with terrifying precision. They were less than 10 meters away. Paul waited until the lead mercenary stepped over the primary suppression nozzle. "Now!" Paul yelled. David slammed the lever down. Thick clouds of freezing white gas erupted from the floor and ceiling. The hallway vanished in a roar of sub-zero mist. Paul heard the mercenaries shouting, distorted, electronic voices through their helmet comms. Their infrared visors were now useless, blinded by a wall of absolute cold. "Move! To the lab!" Paul commanded. They scrambled out of the crawl space, staying low. The air was bitingly cold, stinging their skin, but they knew the station better than any map could show. They bypassed the hub and sprinted toward the laboratory. As they reached the heavy lab doors, Paul looked back. Through the dissipating fog, he saw a green laser sight cutting through the mist. The mercenaries were adjusting. They were professionals. A gas trap would only slow them down for a minute. "In here." Paul shoved Sarah and David into the lab and slammed the door, locking the electronic bolt. "We're trapped in here now," Sarah panted, leaning against a specimen table. "They'll just blow the door like they did the submarine bay." "Let them," Paul said, his eyes scanning the room. He walked to the center of the lab where the golden box had first been found. "I didn't come here to hide. I came here to finish this. David, I need you to overclock the laboratory's induction coils. We're going to give that box exactly what it's been asking for." Paul set the golden box on the primary research pedestal. The stars on its surface seemed to align with the overhead lights. He knew that the box wasn't just treasure. It was a key, and it was time to see what it unlocked. The sound of a heavy hydraulic ram hitting the laboratory door echoed through the room. The steel frame groaned, and dust fell from the ceiling vents. Paul didn't look back. He was focused on the golden box, which sat on the pedestal like a silent judge. David, the induction coils. Connect them to the primary capacitor bank. Paul shouted over the noise. David was a blur of motion, stripping thick copper cables and bolting them to the base of the research pedestal. Paul, if I bypass the safety limiters, we could blow the whole lab. These coils are meant for small samples, not for dumping the station's entire power reserve into a solid block of gold. It's not just gold, David, Paul said, his eyes tracing the star patterns on the box. Look at the alignment. These aren't just decorations. They're magnetic nodes. The box is a Meissner effect device. It needs a massive electromagnetic field to break its internal equilibrium. Paul grabbed a tablet and began calculating the necessary flux density. To overcome the box's internal resistance, they needed to generate a massive electromotive force according to Faraday's law of induction. The door buckled inward. A small gap appeared at the top, and a flashbang grenade bounced onto the lab floor. Close your eyes, Paul yelled, diving behind a lead-lined workbench. The world turned white for a second, followed by a deafening ring. Through the haze, Paul saw the lab door fly off its hinges. The three mercenaries moved in, their red visors glowing through the smoke. They didn't fire. They wanted the box intact. Don't move, the lead mercenary commanded, his voice a cold, synthesized rasp. He leveled his carbine at Paul's chest. David, now! Paul screamed. David slammed the final contact home. The station's lights dimmed to almost nothing as every kilowatt of power was sucked into the laboratory's induction system. A low, vibrating hum began to rise, turning into a bone-shaking roar. A halo of brilliant blue plasma erupted around the golden box. The mercenaries froze, their electronic visors flickering and hissing as the massive electromagnetic pulse scrambled their gear. They clutched their helmets, blinded and disoriented. The golden box didn't just open, it unfolded. The metal plates slid over one another with a sound like 1,000 tiny bells. From within the gold, a pillar of soft, white light shot toward the ceiling. It didn't stop at the roof. It seemed to pass right through the station, through the 3 miles of water, and toward the surface. In the center of the light, a three-dimensional projection began to form. It wasn't a map of treasure. It was a sequence of DNA, complex, shimmering, and definitely not human. It's not gold, Dr. Aries whispered, appearing in the doorway behind the mercenaries, his face transfixed by the light. It's a library. The mercenaries recovered, lifting their weapons. But they were hesitant. The energy in the room was so high that the air smelled of ozone and ancient dust. Paul stood up, the white light reflecting in his eyes. He realized the recovery team wasn't here for the money. They were here to hide the fact that we aren't alone. The laboratory was bathed in a blinding, ethereal glow that defied the laws of the deep ocean. The mercenaries stood frozen, their red visors reflecting the shimmering DNA helix that spiraled through the center of the room. The lead mercenary's rifle began to shake. Even a hardened killer wasn't prepared for the impossible. It's beautiful, Sarah whispered, her face illuminated by the soft white light. She reached out a hand, her fingers passing through a holographic strand of the projection. It's not just DNA. It's a language. Look at the base pairs. Paul squinted at the floating symbols. Instead of the standard adenine, cytosine, guanine, and thymine, the strands were composed of complex geometric shapes that shifted and pulse in a rhythmic pattern. It's a data storage method, Paul realized, his voice low. They didn't use silicon. They used biological encoding. This box isn't an artifact. It's a hard drive. Enough. The lead mercenary barked, finding his voice. He stepped forward, his boots crunching on the glass shards from the broken vials. "Shut it down. Pack it up. Now." "We can't shut it down," David said, pointing to the console. "The power isn't coming from the station anymore. The box is drawing energy directly from the water's ambient pressure. It's a self-sustaining reaction." The lead mercenary didn't care about the science. He raised his carbine, aiming it directly at the pedestal. "If I can't take it, nobody gets to keep the secrets. Move aside." "Wait!" Dr. Aries shouted, stepping between the gun and the light. "If you destroy the resonance field while it's at this energy level, the feedback will vaporize this entire sub-level. The frequency of the signal is nearly 1.42 gigahertz, the hydrogen line. It's a universal broadcast." The mercenary hesitated, his finger tensing on the trigger. In that moment of doubt, the station gave a final, terrifying groan. The light pillar, which had been steady, suddenly flared bright blue. The vibrations in the floor turned from a hum into a violent shaking. "The external hull," Sarah cried, pointing to the monitors that were still functioning. "The pressure. It's too much." Outside the lab windows, the dark shadow of the mercenary submarine was visible. It was a massive, sleek vessel, but it was being pushed against the station by the force of the storm. The docking collar was tearing. A new sound filled the room, not the sound of metal or machines, but a voice. It didn't come from speakers. It resonated directly in their minds. It was a series of tones, mathematical and precise. Sequence 1. A series of prime numbers. Sequence 2. The atomic weight of hydrogen. Sequence 3. A set of coordinates located in the North Atlantic Trench. "It's a map," Paul whispered. "It's showing us where the rest of them are." The lead mercenary growled and lunged for the box, intended to rip it from the pedestal by force. But as his hand touched the gold metal, a massive shockwave of kinetic energy threw everyone to the floor. The laboratory windows, reinforced for the deep sea, began to spiderweb with cracks. "The station is failing," David yelled. "We have to go to the escape pods now." Paul looked at the box, then at the mercenaries who were scrambling to their feet. The secrets of the stars were right in front of him, but the ocean was finally coming to claim its prize. The sound of the cracking glass was like 1,000 crystal bells shattering at once. A thin, needle-like spray of water hissed into the lab, slicing through a plastic chair like a laser. The pressure was no longer just a number on a screen. It was a physical weight pressing against their chests. "The mercenaries are retreating," Sarah yelled, pointing to the monitor. On the screen, the three grey-clad figures were sprinting back toward the submarine bay. They were professionals, and they knew when a mission was a total loss. They weren't going to die for a hard drive if they couldn't get it to the surface. Their sleek black submarine detached from the station with a violent jerk, disappearing into the dark, stormy water. "We have to go. Now." David grabbed Paul's arm. "The pods are in the south sector." "Wait." Paul looked at the golden box. The light helix was fading as the station's power flickered and died, but the box remained open. It was a library of a civilization that wasn't ours. If it stayed here, it would be crushed into dust by the ocean. "Paul, leave it," Sarah pleaded. "It's too heavy. We have to get to the engine room first. We can't leave Miller tied up to drown." Paul hesitated for only a second. He grabbed a heavy-duty nylon equipment bag, shoved the golden box inside, and slung it over his shoulder. The weight was immense, nearly 30 kilograms of dense, alien metal. They ran. The hallways were now half filled with freezing water. They waded through the rising tide, reaching the engine room just as the door began to buckle. Captain Miller was still tied to the pipe, water reaching his waist. His eyes were wide with a terror that transcended greed. "Don't leave me!" Miller screamed. David didn't wait for an order. He used his wrench to smash the zip ties. Miller collapsed into the water, gasping. The pods are already launching." Aries took the first one. "Then we take the last one," Paul shouted. They scrambled toward the escape pod bay. The station was tilting at a 30-degree angle now. Every step was a climb. They reached the final pod, a small, spherical vessel designed for 4 people. Paul shoved Sarah and David inside. Miller scrambled in after them, his face pale and wet. Paul stood at the hatch, the heavy bag with the golden box pulling at his shoulder. He looked back at the station. A massive structural beam snapped, and the laboratory window finally gave way. A wall of blue-black water roared into the hallway. "Paul! Get in!" Sarah screamed, reaching out her hand. Paul dived into the pod, the golden box hitting the floor with a heavy thud. David slammed the hatch shut and engaged the manual seal. Ejecting in 3, 2, 1. The explosive bolts fired. The pod was kicked away from the dying station just as the main hull of Deep Station 7 imploded. The sound was a dull, heavy crump that shook the pod violently. For a moment, they were tumbled in the wake of the collapse, surrounded by debris and bubbles. Then, the pod's internal gyroscopes stabilized. They were no longer sinking. They were rising. The interior of the escape pod was cramped and smelled of recycled air and salt. Outside the reinforced portholes, the water was a wall of absolute, impenetrable black. The only sound was the rhythmic hiss of the oxygen scrubbers and the occasional metallic groan of the pod's hull as the external pressure began to decrease. Paul sat on the floor, his back against the vibrating wall, clutching the bag containing the golden box. Beside him, Sarah was checking David's head wound with a small medical kit. In the corner, Captain Miller sat in silence, his head bowed, his hands still bound by the heavy-duty ties. "How long until we reach the surface?" Sarah asked, her voice a fragile whisper. "We're ascending at about 3 meters per second." David said, glancing at the glowing depth gauge. "At this rate, we have about 25 minutes of up left. The pressure is dropping fast." As they rose, the physics of their situation changed. At the bottom, they were under nearly 480 atmospheres of pressure. As they moved toward the surface, the force on the hull decreased linearly according to the depth. "The storm will still be waiting for us up there," Paul reminded them. "The pod is built to bob like a cork, but we won't be safe until a rescue ship finds us. Or until the mercenaries find us," Miller said suddenly, looking up. His eyes were red and hollow. "You think you won? That box is a beacon. As long as it's active, they can track the signal. You didn't save us, Paul. You just brought the target to the surface." Paul looked down at the bag. He could feel a strange, rhythmic vibration coming from the box, a heartbeat that seemed to pulse in time with his own. "Then we don't give them a chance to find it." 10 minutes later, the water outside the window began to change. The absolute blackness shifted into a deep, bruised purple, then a dark, midnight blue. For the first time in months, they saw the faint, ghostly glow of sunlight filtering down from above. It was a sight so beautiful that Sarah began to cry silently. 500 meters. David announced. 300, 100. Suddenly, the pod began to rock violently. They had hit the surface turbulence of the storm. The sphere was tossed around like a toy, the survivors gripping the handrails as they were thrown against each other. Then, with a final, massive lurch and the sound of crashing waves, the pod broke the surface. Through the porthole, Paul saw a world of grey chaos. Massive waves, some 10 meters high, crashed against the glass. The sky was a swirling vortex of dark clouds. But there, cutting through the rain with a brilliant white spotlight, was a ship. It wasn't the sleek, charcoal grey of the mercenaries. It was the bright, defiant orange and white of a global research vessel. "They found us," Sarah breathed. Paul looked at the golden box one last time. He knew that the world was about to change. The data inside this box, the biological library of an alien race, would rewrite history, science, and religion. But as the rescue crane lowered its hook toward their bobbing pod, he felt a strange sense of peace. The secrets of Deep Station 7 were finally coming home. The transition from the crushing silence of the abyss to the roaring chaos of the North Atlantic surface was jarring. Inside the escape pod, the 4 survivors were tossed like dice in a cup. The heavy bag containing the golden box slid across the floor, thudding against Paul's shins. Every time a massive wave slammed into the reinforced hull, the metal groaned, reminding them that while they had escaped the pressure of the deep, they were now at the mercy of the wind and the spray. "Stay down," Paul shouted over the thunderous percussion of the waves. He gripped a stabilizing strap with one hand and braced his boots against the opposite bench. "The beacon is active," David yelled back, pointing to a small, pulsing green light on the pod's control dash. "The research vessel is moving toward us, but the sea state is too high for a standard crane recovery. They're going to have to use the recovery net." Through the salt-streaked porthole, the global research vessel, the Alethea, looked like a ghost ship. Its massive orange hull would rise on a swell, towering over their tiny pod, only to disappear entirely into the trough of the next wave. The blinding white beam of its spotlight swept across the dark, churning water, finally locking onto the reflective strips of their escape craft. Sarah was huddled next to Paul, her eyes fixed on the depth gauge, which now sat at 0. "We're really here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We're actually above the water." Captain Miller, still bound in the corner, didn't look at the light. He was staring at the golden box. Even through the thick nylon of the equipment bag, the artifact seemed to emit a low-frequency hum that vibrated through the floor of the pod. It was as if the box was reacting to the open sky, or perhaps to the vast distance it had traveled from its home in the silt. Suddenly, a massive shadow loomed over them. The Alethea had maneuvered into position, creating a temporary lee, a patch of calmer water protected by the ship's massive hull. A heavy, industrial-strength rope net splashed into the water beside them. "They're snagging us," David cheered. The pod lurched as the net's heavy cables tightened. They felt the sensation of being lifted, the water draining away from the portholes. For a moment, they dangled in the air, buffeted by the freezing gale-force winds. Then, with a series of heavy mechanical clunks, the pod was lowered onto the solid, stable deck of the research ship. The hatch hissed open. The cold, fresh air of the Atlantic rushed in, smelling of salt, rain, and diesel, the most beautiful scent Paul had ever encountered. A team of deckhands in yellow rain slicks reached in to pull them out. "Easy now," a voice called out. "We've got you." Paul was the last one out. He refused to let the deckhands take the heavy bag. He stepped onto the wet deck, his legs shaking with sea legs after months in the static environment of the station. He looked around at the crew of the Alethea. They weren't just sailors. There were people in lab coats and men in suits with earpieces. He clutched the golden box to his chest. The rescue was complete. But as he saw the serious faces of the men in suits, he realized the battle for the secret was only just beginning. They had survived the ocean, but the world of men was often far more dangerous than the deep. The Alethea was a fortress of modern science, a floating laboratory that felt worlds away from the cramped, leaking corridors of Deep Station 7. However, the comfort was an illusion. Paul, Sarah, and David were immediately separated upon boarding. While Sarah and David were taken to the medical bay, Paul was escorted by 2 silent, broad-shouldered men in dark tactical gear to a secure briefing room below the bridge. The room was sterile, lit by harsh fluorescent panels that made Paul's eyes ache. In the center sat a long mahogany table, and at the head of it was a woman Paul didn't recognize. She wore a crisp gray suit and had her hair pulled back in a tight, professional bun. On the table between them sat the nylon bag, still dripping saltwater onto the polished wood. "Sit down, Mr. Vance," she said. Her voice was like dry parchment. "I am Director Halloway. I represent the Oversight Committee for this expedition." Paul sat, his muscles stiffening. "I want to see my team. And I want to know what happened to Captain Miller. Captain Miller is being detained for questioning regarding the sabotage of a multi-billion-dollar research facility." Halloway replied coolly, "Your team is being treated for decompression sickness and exhaustion. They are safe. Now, let's talk about what is in that bag." Paul didn't move. He felt the weight of the golden box even from across the table. "You know what's in it. You've been monitoring the transmissions. You saw the signal." Halloway leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "We saw a massive energy discharge that nearly sank our most advanced deep-sea installation. We saw a broadcast on the 1.42 GHz frequency that was picked up by every SETI dish on the planet. You've opened a door, Mr. Vance, and you don't even know what's on the other side." Paul reached into the bag and pulled the box out. In the bright light of the room, the gold didn't just shine, it seemed to absorb the light. The star patterns were now permanently etched with a faint, iridescent violet hue. "It's not just a door," Paul said, his voice regaining its strength. "It's an invitation. This box contains biological data, DNA sequences that don't match anything in Earth's fossil record. It's an archive. Whoever left it down there was waiting for us to become technologically advanced enough to find it and power it up." Halloway signaled to one of the guards, who placed a high-resolution scanner on the table. "We are going to take the box now, Paul. For the safety of the public and the security of the state, this discovery must be classified at the highest level. You can't hide this." Paul countered. The signal went out. The mercenaries who tried to kill us. Who were they? They weren't from a rival company. They knew exactly what to look for. There are entities, Mr. Vance, that believe some truths are too heavy for the world to carry," Halloway said. She stood up, her face a mask of iron. "You are a safety expert. Your job was to ensure the station's integrity. You failed. From this point on, you are a guest of this vessel until we reach land. Do not attempt to contact the outside world." As the guards moved to take the box, Paul noticed something. A small, rhythmic blinking was occurring on the underside of the box, invisible to Halloway. The resonance hadn't stopped. It was accelerating. The box wasn't just a library anymore. It was a beacon, and it was still calling out to the dark. The isolation of the briefing room felt more oppressive than the depths of the ocean. Paul watched as the guards carried the golden box away in a specialized lead-lined container. Director Halloway followed them, leaving Paul alone with his thoughts and the dull hum of the Alethea's engines. He knew the box was still active. That rhythmic blinking he'd spotted was a countdown or a synchronization. He stood up and paced the room. His mind was a whirlwind of physics and fear. If the box was broadcasting at $1.42/GZ, it was targeting the most fundamental frequency in the universe, the waterhole where interstellar communication is most likely to occur. But it wasn't just sending a message out. It was pulling something in. A soft click at the door interrupted his thoughts. He expected the guards, but instead, Sarah slipped inside. She looked better, clean clothes and a bandage on her arm, but her eyes were frantic. "Paul, we have to move," she whispered, checking the hallway behind her. "David is in the comms room. He found something on the ship's long-range sensors. Halloway isn't telling us everything." "How did you get past the guards?" Paul asked, moving toward her. They are distracted. The ship's internal sensors are going haywire. It's the box, she explained, pulling him into the corridor. The lead lining isn't stopping the signal. It's actually amplifying it. The metal of the ship is acting like a giant satellite dish. They navigated the white-walled corridors of the Alethea, avoiding the main patrols. They reached the secondary communications hub, a cramped room filled with glowing monitors. David was there, his fingers flying across a keyboard. He looked up, his face grim. "Look at this, Paul," David said, pointing to a thermal map of the surrounding ocean. When the box flared in the lab, it didn't just send a signal to the sky. It created a thermal wake in the water. "Something is following us." Paul leaned in. A distinct heat signature was visible on the screen, moving at a speed that no known submarine could achieve. It was staying exactly 500 meters behind the Alethea, mirroring every turn. "Is it the mercenaries?" Sarah asked. "No." David shook his head. "The signature is too large, and there's no propeller noise. It's silent. It's moving by some kind of magneto-hydrodynamic drive, but on a scale that shouldn't be possible. It's the recovery team," Paul realized. But not the one Holloway is waiting for. The box didn't just wake up the world, it woke up the owners. Suddenly, the ship's intercom crackled to life. Holloway's voice sounded tense, stripped of its professional calm. "All hands to battle stations. Unidentified contact closing fast. Bridge to security. Initiate Protocol 0 on the artifact immediately." "Protocol 0 means dumping it," David said, his voice dropping an octave. "They're going to throw it back into the ocean to save themselves." "We can't let them do that," Paul said, his hand gripping the back of David's chair. "If that box hits the water in its current state, the energy release will be like a depth charge. It'll tear the Alethea apart. We have to stabilize it." "And how do we do that?" Sarah asked. "We need to get to the high-voltage lab," Paul said. "We need to reverse the induction. We have to put the library back to sleep before the owners come to take it by force." The Alethea groaned as a massive rogue wave, unnatural and perfectly timed, slammed into the starboard hull. In the communications hub, the monitors flickered violently. Paul led Sarah and David out into the corridor, their footsteps muffled by the industrial carpeting. The ship was in a state of controlled panic. Sailors were sprinting to damaged control stations, and the hum of the engines had risen to a desperate, high-pitched whine. "The high-voltage lab is 3 decks down, near the secondary reactor," David whispered, checking a digital map on his handheld tablet. "If Holloway is initiating Protocol 0, they'll be moving the box to the emergency ejection chute in the same sector." They reached the main stairwell, but the door was locked electronically. Paul didn't hesitate. He pulled a small multi-tool from his belt, a relic from his safety kit, and jammed it into the manual release. "Sarah, watch the corridor. David, get that door open. We don't have time for a keycard." As David worked on the wiring, the ship shuddered again. This time, it wasn't a wave. It was a magnetic pull. Paul looked out a nearby porthole and saw the water around the ship beginning to glow with a pale, bioluminescent green. The owners were no longer following. They were surfacing. "Doors open," David hissed. They tumbled down the stairs, descending into the bowels of the ship where the air was thick with the smell of ozone and hot metal. They reached the high-voltage lab just as a team of 4 security guards was loading the lead-line container onto a hydraulic lift. Director Holloway stood by the controls, her face illuminated by the harsh red emergency lights. "Stop!" Paul shouted, his voice echoing off the reinforced walls. Holloway turned, her eyes cold. "Mr. Vance, you are interfering with a command decision." That thing is a magnet for whatever is out there. We are purging it before it pulls this ship under. If you eject that box while it's in a state of high resonance, you'll create a cavitation bubble the size of a city block. Paul stepped forward, hands raised to show he wasn't armed. The pressure differential alone will implode the Alethea's hull. You can't just throw it away. You have to discharge the internal capacitor first. He's right, David added, moving toward a secondary console. The box has stored a massive amount of potential energy in its magnetic field. If you break the circuit by dumping it into the water, you get an instantaneous release. The security guards looked at Holloway, their grip on their rifles wavering. The ship lurched again, tilting a full 20 degrees. Pipes overhead began to hiss steam. 20 seconds to contact. A voice crackled over the intercom. Fine. Holloway snapped, her survival instinct finally overriding her pride. Fix it. You have 2 minutes before I blow the hatch anyway. Paul and David sprinted to the central pedestal. David began connecting heavy-duty grounding cables to the lead container, while Paul accessed the lab's primary induction controller. He needed to create an out-of-phase electromagnetic field to cancel the box's resonance. I need to match the frequency exactly, Paul muttered, his fingers flying across the touchscreen. If I'm off by even a fraction of a hertz, the constructive interference will cause the box to detonate. The green light outside the ship was now so bright it bled through the ventilation ducts. The owners were directly beneath the hull. The air in the lab began to hum, and Paul's hair stood on end from the static. He found the frequency and prepared to hit the reverse. The laboratory air was thick with the scent of ionizing oxygen. Paul's fingers danced across the console, his vision blurring slightly from the intense electromagnetic field. The golden box, still encased in its lead container, was vibrating so violently that the heavy metal box was rattling against the hydraulic lift. Frequency locked. Paul shouted, I'm initiating the phase reversal. David, stay on those grounding lines. If they slip, the current will ground through the floor, and us. Ready. David yelled, his hands encased in thick, rubberized insulating gloves. He was braced against the wall, holding the heavy copper clamps in place. Paul slammed his palm onto the execute command. A deep, guttural growl emerged from the station's secondary reactor as it dumped a massive countercharge into the lab's induction coils. For a heartbeat, the two forces, the box's ancient broadcast and the ship's modern interference, clashed. The air in the room turned a shimmering violet, and a high-pitched whine, right at the edge of human hearing, made everyone's teeth ache. The math of the cancellation was precise. Paul was using destructive interference. By generating a wave that was exactly out of phase with the box's signal, the total amplitude of the electromagnetic wave was reduced to 0. Slowly, the vibration began to die down. The violet light faded, replaced by the dull, flickering red of the ship's emergency lighting. The lead container stopped rattling. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the ragged breathing of the people in the room. It's quiet, Sarah whispered, stepping out from behind a protective lead shield. Holloway checked her handheld scanner. The signal is gone. Thermal signatures outside are fading. No, they are descending. Paul leaned his forehead against the cool glass of the console. He was drenched in sweat. The owners weren't attacking us. They were homing in on the distress call. By nulling the signal, we told them the emergency is over. Or we told them the asset is dead. Holloway said, her voice regaining its edge. She signaled the guards. Secure the room. No one enters or leaves. I need to contact the mainland. This isn't just a discovery anymore. It's an international incident. As the guards moved to surround them, David caught Paul's eye. He pointed subtly to the primary monitor. The signal wasn't entirely gone. There was a tiny, residual pulse, too small for Holloway's scanner to pick up, but clear on the lab's high-sensitivity equipment. It wasn't a broadcast anymore. It was a local loop. The box was no longer talking to the stars. It was talking to the ship's computer. "Paul," David mouthed. "It's downloading." Paul realized with a jolt of terror that by nulling the signal, he hadn't put the library to sleep. He had opened a high-speed data port. The Alethea wasn't just carrying the box. It was becoming the box. The alien DNA sequences, the coordinates, the history of a lost world. It was all flowing into the ship's hard drives. And if Holloway found out, they would never be allowed to leave this ship alive. The high-voltage lab was a tomb of silent tension. While Director Holloway's guards stood like statues at the exits, Paul and David remained huddled over the primary console, their bodies shielding the flickering monitor from view. The data transfer was a silent torrent. A progress bar, rendered in a strange, shifting font that the ship's OS was struggling to interpret, crawled across the bottom of the screen. "It's rewriting the directory," David whispered, his voice trembling. "It's not just saving files. It's restructuring the entire file system into a non-linear architecture. If this finishes, the Alethea won't be a research vessel anymore. It'll be a floating alien server." Paul looked at the lead container. The golden box sat inside, inert and dark, but the bridge he had inadvertently created with the phase reversal was still open. "Can you stop it? If Holloway sees the storage capacity of this ship hit 100% in 10 minutes, she'll know." "I can't pull the plug," David said, sweat dripping from his chin onto the keyboard. "The box has hijacked the root kernel. If I force a shutdown, the data corruption could cause a hardware fire in the server room. We need a diversion." Sarah, who had been listening from a few feet away, stepped closer. She looked at the security guards, then at the fire suppression override on the wall. "I can give you 5 minutes. But you have to promise me that whatever is in that data stays with us. If the government gets a hold of biological blueprints for an alien race, they won't use it to heal people. They'll use it to build things we can't control." "I promise," Paul said, his eyes meeting hers. Sarah didn't wait. She walked toward the exit, stumbling slightly to catch the attention of the nearest guard. I think I'm going to be sick. The ozone. I can't breathe." The guard hesitated, but as Sarah slumped against a stack of crates, his training kicked in. He moved to catch her, and the other guard at the door turned to help. In that moment of distracted focus, Sarah's hand shot out and pulled the manual fire alarm. A siren tore through the lab. Above them, the overhead sprinklers didn't release water. They released a thick, white chemical fog designed to smother electrical fires. "Go!" Paul hissed. Under the cover of the fog, David pulled a portable high-capacity drive from his pocket, a black box he used for emergency backups. He slammed it into the bypass port. "I'm rerouting the stream. I'm mirroring the data to this drive, and then I'll trigger a ghost delete on the main server. It'll look like the system crashed and wiped the data." "How long?" Paul asked, coughing as the chemical fog filled his lungs. 30 seconds. David's fingers were a blur. Through the mist, Paul saw Holloway shouting commands, her silhouette a dark blur in the chaos. She was trying to reach the console, but the fog was too thick. 90%. 95%. Complete. David ripped the portable drive out just as Holloway's hand slammed onto the desk. The monitors went black. What happened? "Oh!" Holloway screamed, her face red with fury. "Report." The surge was too much for the cooling system. "Director!" Paul shouted back, faking a panicked tone. The fire suppression triggered because the server racks overheated. "The data. I think we lost the link." Holloway pushed him aside and stared at the dark screens. If that data is gone, Vance, you'll be spending the rest of your life in a dark room. Paul felt the weight of the portable drive in David's hand. They had the library, but they were still trapped on a ship controlled by a woman who would kill to get it back. The chemical fog settled slowly, leaving a thin, white powder over every surface of the high-voltage lab. The silence that followed the siren was brittle. Director Holloway stood at the darkened console, her reflection caught in the black glass of the monitors. She looked like a woman who had just watched $1 billion vanish into thin air. "Check the backup arrays," Holloway said, her voice terrifyingly quiet. "Now." A technician, shivering from the cold discharge of the fire system, scrambled to comply. His fingers tapped hesitantly on the backup keyboard. "The directory it's empty. Director." The file allocation table was wiped during the suppression cycle. "It looks like a catastrophic hardware interrupt." Paul stood nearby, his heart hammering against his ribs. David had tucked the portable drive, the only surviving copy of the alien library, into his heavy thermal jumpsuit. It was a small piece of plastic and silicon, no larger than a deck of cards, yet it felt like it weighed 1,000 tons. "Search them," Holloway commanded, not looking up from the screen. The guards moved in. Paul felt a surge of cold panic. If they found the drive, David would be lucky if he only ended up in a military prison. But just as the lead guard reached for David's collar, the ship's intercom shrieked with a sound that wasn't human. It was a series of high-pitched, harmonic pulses, the same heartbeat Paul had heard in the deep. The Alethea tilted sharply to the port side. The sound of metal grinding against metal echoed from the lower decks. "Direct hit," a voice screamed over the radio. Something just punched through the hull in the submarine bay. "We have incoming water." The guards hesitated, their hands dropping. In the hierarchy of a sinking ship, survival always trumps security. "Get to the bay," Holloway ordered the guards. She turned to Paul, her eyes burning with a mix of hatred and desperation. "If we go down, you go down with us. Move. To the bridge. Now." As they were herded toward the exit, Paul caught a glimpse of the external monitors. The glowing green light from the depths had moved. It wasn't underneath them anymore. It was attached to them. A massive, bioluminescent shape was clamped onto the side of the Alethea, its edges shimmering with a heat that was boiling the surrounding seawater. "They aren't waiting for the signal anymore," David whispered as they ran through the tilting corridor. "They're coming to reclaim the hardware." The physics of the boarding was brutal. The unknown craft was using a form of thermal magnetic tethering, essentially melting its way through the ship's reinforced hull plates. By concentrating energy into a localized area, it bypassed the structural integrity of the steel. The Alethea was a modern marvel, but it was being sliced open like a tin can. They reached the bridge, where the chaos was absolute. The captain was shouting into a radio, trying to coordinate the evacuation of the lower decks. Outside the panoramic windows, the storm raged, but the water near the hull was eerily calm, glowing with that sickeningly beautiful green light. "They're on deck 4, the captain reported, his face pale. "Internal security isn't responding. They walk through the walls." "Holloway, the cameras are seeing shadows that aren't there." Paul looked at David. The portable drive was still secure. They had the data, the ship was being boarded by its owners, and the storm was trying to tear them apart. It was time for a new plan, one that involved leaving the Alethea before the shadows reached the bridge. The bridge of the Alethea was a frantic hive of failing systems and desperate men. Rain lashed against the thick glass, illuminated by the rhythmic, sickly green pulse from the boarding craft. Director Holloway was hunched over a radar display, her face ghostly in the glow. "They've reached the main computer core," she said, her voice hollow. The internal sensors are reporting a complete system override. It's not just a hack, they're physicalizing the data. Paul moved toward the window, his eyes scanning the deck below. He saw them. 3 figures, taller than any human, moved through the chemical fog on the main deck. They didn't walk so much as glide, their forms shifting like oil on water. They didn't use weapons. Wherever they touched the ship's bulkhead, the metal simply turned to liquid, allowing them passage. They're after the box, Sarah whispered, clutching Paul's arm. But the box is empty now. The library is on David's drive. They don't know that yet, Paul said. He looked at David, who was holding the portable drive inside his jacket as if it were his own heart. Holloway, if you want to save this ship, you have to let us go. They are following the signature. As long as we're on the bridge is their target. Holloway turned, a flicker of her old coldness returning. I'm not letting that data walk off this ship with a safety inspector and a mechanic. Then you're choosing to die for a blank gold box. Paul countered. The owners are on their way up here. If they find you with the hardware and no data, they won't leave witnesses. A heavy vibration moved through the floorboards. The elevator at the back of the bridge hissed, its doors glowing red as the metal began to soften. The security guards raised their rifles, their hands shaking. David, Sarah, get to the secondary life raft station on the port side, Paul ordered, his voice low and commanding. Miller, if you want a chance at a reduced sentence, you help them. Miller, who had been huddled near the chart table, nodded frantically. The life rafts have their own independent GPS. We can be 5 miles away before they even realize the ship is empty. Vance, stay where you are. Holloway reached for her sidearm, but the bridge lights suddenly flared a blinding white. The elevator doors didn't open. They disintegrated. A wave of intense cold swept into the room, turning the humid air into falling snow. A figure stepped onto the bridge. It was draped in a suit that looked like woven starlight, its face a smooth, featureless visor of dark obsidian. The guards fired. The bullets didn't hit the figure. They slowed down as they entered a localized gravitational field around the being, eventually falling to the floor. The figure didn't retaliate. It raised a hand, and every screen on the bridge displayed the same image, the DNA helix from the golden box. A series of tones, identical to the ones Paul had heard in the deep, resonated through the room. It's asking for the library, Sarah whispered. Paul stood his ground. He knew that if he handed over the drive now, Holloway would likely have them killed the moment their owners left. But if he ran, the figure would hunt them across the ocean. The library is safe, Paul said, speaking directly to the obsidian visor. But your recovery team killed my friends. You nearly sank our station. The figure tilted its head. The tones changed, becoming lower, more mournful. It pointed toward the golden box, which was still in its lead container on the deck below. Go, Paul whispered to David. Now, while they're focused on me. Under the cover of the standoff, David, Sarah, and Miller slipped through the side emergency exit. Paul was left alone on the bridge with Holloway, the terrified guards, and a traveler from the stars. The silence on the bridge was more terrifying than the storm. The alien figure, a shadow, as Paul now thought of it, remained perfectly still. The air around it rippled, a visual distortion caused by the intense gravitational field it projected. Director Holloway's hand remained frozen on her holster, her eyes wide with a mixture of predatory greed and primal fear. It's not attacking, Paul said, his voice steady. He kept his hands visible. It's waiting. It's a negotiator, not a soldier. It's an intruder, Holloway hissed, though she didn't draw her weapon. It's on my ship, and it's taken my data. The shadow moved its arm in a slow, sweeping arc. The obsidian visor flickered, and a holographic projection expanded to fill the bridge. It wasn't the DNA helix this time. It was a star map, but not one Paul recognized. The constellations were shifted, viewed from a perspective light-years away from Earth. A single point of light pulsed red, a coordinate in the deep Atlantic. They aren't from out there, Paul realized, his mind racing through the physics of the signal. They've been here, in the trenches. They've been under the crust for longer than we've had fire. The golden box wasn't a message sent to the stars. It was a message sent to the surface. The shadow's tones resonated again. The frequency was so low it made the windows rattle. Paul felt the meaning behind the sounds, a mathematical imprint directly in his cortex. It was a warning. The library contained the history of Earth's climate cycles, recorded with a precision no human instrument could match. The data David had on the drive was a blueprint of a planet that was reaching a tipping point. The DNA, Paul whispered. It's not just alien. It's a catalogue of every species that has gone extinct during the last 3 major shifts. They are collectors. They are waiting for the next one. Holloway stepped forward, her ambition overriding her caution. If that data contains the keys to biological preservation, it belongs to the human race. We can use it to fix the damage. The shadow turned its featureless face toward her. The gravitational distortion intensified. A coffee mug on the chart table shattered into dust, crushed by a sudden spike in localized pressure. Holloway stumbled back, gasping as the air was literally pulled from her lungs. "You don't want to fix it," Paul said to Holloway, his voice cold. "You want to weaponize it. You want to decide who lives and who goes into the collection." The shadow raised its hand again. On the screens, the data transfer bar, which had been empty, suddenly surged. But it wasn't downloading to the ship. It was deleting. Every file related to the project, every scan of the golden box, every record of Deep Station 7 was being systematically scrubbed from the Alethea's servers. "No!" Holloway screamed, lunging for the main console. The shadow didn't move to stop her. It didn't have to. The console turned to liquid beneath her fingers, the electronics melting into a useless slag of silicon and gold. The owner was reclaiming its history, leaving nothing behind but the memories of the survivors. Paul checked his watch. David, Sarah, and Miller should have reached the life raft by now. He had to get off this bridge before the shadow decided to take him as part of the collection too. "We're done here," Paul said. He backed toward the emergency exit, never taking his eyes off the obsidian visor. The shadow didn't follow. It simply stood in the center of the bridge, a silent monument to a civilization that had watched humanity grow from the shadows of the deep. The emergency exit opened, letting in a blast of freezing rain and the roar of the Atlantic. Paul didn't look back. He sprinted down the narrow external walkway, his boots slipping on the metal grating. Behind him, the bridge of the Alethea was a tomb of emerald light and melting steel. He could still feel the shadow's gravitational pull, a heavy tug at the base of his skull that made every step feel like walking through waist-deep water. He reached the portside life raft station. The cradle was empty. "Paul, over here." He looked down. Bobbing in the churning, phosphorescent water 10 meters below was the bright orange survival raft. David was standing in the center, waving a flare, while Sarah and Miller sat huddled against the inflatable sides. The raft was tethered to the ship by a single, straining line. "Jump!" Sarah screamed over the gale. Paul looked at the height. In a calm sea, it was a simple drop. In a storm, with a massive research vessel rolling like a wounded whale, it was a gamble with death. If the ship rolled toward the raft, he'd be crushed against the hull. If it rolled away, he'd miss the target and be swept into the dark. He took a deep breath, calculating the timing of the swells. As the Alethea dipped into a trough, he vaulted over the railing. For a second, There was only the weightless rush of cold air and the scream of the wind. Then, a bone-jarring impact. He hit the water just inches from the raft. The cold was a physical blow, a liquid iron that stole the air from his lungs. David's strong hands grabbed his collar, hauling him over the side and into the relative safety of the raft. "Cut it! Cut the line!" Paul wheezed, salt water stinging his eyes. David hacked at the tether with a survival knife. The line snapped. Freed from the Alethea, the raft was immediately swept away by the current. Paul scrambled to the stern and looked back at the ship they had just fled. It was a sight he would never forget. The Alethea was no longer a ship. It was a silhouette framed by a pillar of green light that stretched from the ocean floor to the clouds. The owner's craft had moved to the center of the deck, its form now a shimmering, crystalline spire. The physics of the ship's buoyancy were being rewritten. The massive vessel was being lifted, actually lifted, out of the water. Thousands of tons of steel rose into the air, water cascading off the hull in great, white sheets. The gravitational field was so intense that the rain around the ship began to spiral upward, defying the storm. "They're taking the whole thing," David whispered, clutching the portable drive to his chest. "They aren't just taking the box. They're taking the evidence. Look." Sarah pointed. As the Alethea reached a height of 50 meters, the green light flared into a blinding, silent flash. When Paul's vision cleared, the ship was gone. The ocean where it had sat was a boiling, steaming cauldron. But the horizon was empty. No wreckage, no oil slick, no bodies. The shadow had reclaimed its library, and Director Holloway along with it. Paul sank onto the floor of the raft, the rain washing the salt from his face. They were alone in the North Atlantic, 3 miles above a ghost station, with nothing but a plastic drive and a story that no one would ever believe. The silence that followed the disappearance of the Alethea was more deafening than the storm itself. One moment, a 100-meter research vessel had been the center of their world. The next, it was a memory, leaving behind nothing but a smooth, circular depression in the water that was rapidly being filled by the crashing Atlantic swells. The orange life raft felt impossibly small, a tiny speck of synthetic rubber bobbing in a vast, gray graveyard. "They're gone," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. She stared at the empty horizon where the green pillar had been. "Holloway, the crew, the station, it's all gone." David reached into his thermal jumpsuit and pulled out the portable drive. It was a rugged, black box, no larger than a thick smartphone, but in the dim light of the storm, it seemed to pulse with a phantom energy. He held it with both hands, his knuckles white. "We have the only record of what happened," David said. He looked at Paul. "Everything they collected, everything their owners recorded about our planet. It's all in here." Paul wiped the freezing rain from his eyes. He looked at Miller, who was staring at the drive with a look of pure, unadulterated fear. The captain was no longer the arrogant man who had tried to sell the golden box. He was a man who had seen the fundamental laws of physics rewritten in a heartbeat. "What's the plan, Paul?" Miller asked, his voice shaking. "If we show this to the authorities, they'll bury us. They'll bury the drive, and then they'll bury us to make sure we don't talk." Paul considered the physics of the situation. The data on the drive was compressed using an alien architecture, but the information density was staggering. If he assumed the drive held roughly $10 15 bits of data in a volume of $100 $text $3, the information density would be $10 13 text $3. That was thousands of times more dense than the most advanced human storage. But it wasn't just the density that mattered. It was the content. "Miller is right about one thing," Paul said, looking at the gray waves. "We can't just hand this over to the first Coast Guard cutter that finds us. This data shows the Earth's climate cycles, the DNA of extinct species. It's a manual for the planet. Whoever holds this holds the future of the human race. We should destroy it," Sarah said suddenly. The others looked at her in shock. Think about it. The owners took everything else. They left us here. And they left us with this. Why? Maybe it's a test. Or maybe they knew that if we kept it, we'd destroy ourselves fighting over it. We can't destroy it, David argued. It's the history of our world. It's the truth. The truth is too heavy for the world right now, Paul said, echoing Holloway's words, but with a different intent. We're drifting in the North Atlantic current. If the GPS on this raft is working, we're being pulled toward the UK or Norway. We have a few days before we're found. He looked at each of them. In those days, we decide, not as employees of a corporation, or as survivors of a wreck, but as the only people who know that we aren't the masters of this world. We keep the drive hidden. We find a way to leak the information slowly, anonymously, so it can't be monopolized. As the raft rose on the crest of a massive swell, Paul saw a faint, blinking light on the horizon. It wasn't green. It was a steady, rhythmic white. A search plane. The world is coming for us. Paul whispered. Hide the drive. David. The story starts now. The white light on the horizon wasn't a hallucination. It was the piercing halogen eye of a C-130 Hercules, banking low over the white-capped peaks of the Atlantic. The roar of its engines drowned out the rhythmic slapping of the waves against the raft's rubber sides. For the survivors, the sound was both a promise of life and a death knell for their secrets. Flares! Paul shouted. David fumbled with a survival kit, pulling out a plastic tube. With a sharp tug, a brilliant crimson light hissed into the sky, trailing a plume of thick smoke that the gale-force winds immediately whipped away. The plane dipped its wings. A signal. They had been spotted. Listen to me, Paul said, grabbing the attention of the others as the plane circled back. From this moment on, we were victims of a catastrophic structural failure. The golden box. It was lost when the station imploded. The Alethea. We saw it get hit by a rogue wave and capsize in the storm. We don't know anything about shadows or green lights. And the drive. David whispered, his hand pressed against his chest where the black box sat beneath his layers of clothing. The drive stays with you. Paul said. If they search us, it's just a portable backup of your personal music and family photos. We need to get to a civilian hospital, not a military debriefing. Miller, if you stick to this, I'll tell them you were the hero who unlocked the escape pods. Miller looked at the approaching plane, then at the three people who had every reason to leave him behind. He nodded slowly. I'm a dead man either way if I tell the truth. I'll stay quiet. The rescue was a blur of high-stakes coordination. The C-130 dropped a series of high-visibility smoke markers and a radio-equipped supply pod. Within the hour, a Coast Guard cutter, the Vigilant, was visible on the horizon, cutting through the swells like a serrated knife. When the rescue swimmers finally hit the water, the transition felt surreal. Paul felt the firm, gloved hands of a diver pulling him onto a hoist. He was lifted into the air, the freezing spray of the ocean falling away as he was hauled into the belly of a Jayhawk helicopter that had arrived ahead of the ship. The interior of the helicopter was a world of olive drab and medical equipment. A corpsman immediately threw a thermal blanket over Paul's shoulders and began checking his vitals. You're lucky, sir, the corpsman shouted over the rotor wash. That storm is one for the record books. We've got 2 others from your raft in the back. The captain is being hoisted now. Paul looked across the cabin. Sarah and David were already strapped into seats. David looked pale, his eyes darting toward the corpsman's gear, but he gave Paul a subtle nod. The drive was still there. As the helicopter banked away, Paul looked out the window one last time. The ocean looked vast and indifferent, a grey desert that hid its secrets well. Deep Station 7 was gone. The Alethea was gone. But as the warmth of the cabin began to thaw his frozen skin, Paul felt a different kind of chill. They weren't being taken to a public hospital. He noticed the patch on the pilot's shoulder. It wasn't the Coast Guard. It was a private security firm, the same one that had funded the Alethea. Holloway's people had found them first. The hum of the Jayhawk's rotors changed pitch as the aircraft began its descent. Paul looked out the small, scratched window, expecting to see the bustling docks of a coastal city or the landing pad of a regional hospital. Instead, he saw a stark, concrete island jutting out of the grey Atlantic, a decommissioned naval fort that had been retrofitted with modern satellite arrays and high-voltage fencing. "This isn't a hospital," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the engine noise. She had noticed the same thing Paul had. The medics in the back of the helicopter weren't checking 4 drips. They were checking the seals on their sidearms. "Sit back and stay quiet," the lead operative commanded. He didn't look like a rescuer. He looked like a jailer. The helicopter touched down on a pad marked with a black sun logo, the symbol of the Vanguard Group, the parent corporation that had funded both the station and the Alethea. As the bay doors slid open, the heat of the facility's industrial generators hit Paul in the face. They were marched out into a line of armed guards. "Where is Director Holloway?" Paul demanded as they were led down a sterile, windowless corridor. "Director Holloway is unavailable," the operative replied. "You are here for a mandatory quarantine and debriefing. Given the biological nature of the artifact you encountered, we cannot risk public exposure." They were ushered into a high-tech observation suite. It was comfortable, soft chairs, a stocked fridge, and warm blankets. But the door was a 3-inch slab of reinforced steel that locked with a definitive electronic thud. Paul immediately began pacing the room, his eyes scanning for cameras and microphones. "They're going to strip search us," David said, his voice trembling. He was sitting on the edge of a bed, his hands still clutched over the bulge of the drive in his jumpsuit. "Paul, I can't keep this hidden for much longer. Once they get us into those orange jumpsuits, the drive is gone." Paul looked at the ceiling. "The vents." "David, the ventilation system in these old forts is usually interconnected. If we can get that drive into the server room of this facility, we might be able to use their own hardware to hide the data." "That's suicide," Miller said, sitting in the corner. "This place is a fortress. We have one advantage," Paul said, leaning in close so his voice was a mere breath. "They think they're looking for a golden box. They don't know the library is digital now. They think the data died with the Alethea. We need to upload the drive to their secure cloud, but encrypt it with a dead man's switch. If they kill us, the data goes public. If they keep us alive, we're the only ones with the decryption key." "I need a terminal," David said, his eyes regaining their focus. "Any terminal. Even the smart fridge in the corner has enough processing power to act as a gateway if I can bypass the firewall." The physics of their situation was simple. They were in a Faraday cage. No signals were getting out. But internal networks were another story. Paul walked over to the smart fridge, a sleek, stainless steel unit. He looked at the touchscreen interface. "Can you do it?" Paul asked. "I can try," David said. "But once I start the upload, the facility's AI will flag the spike in traffic. We'll have about 90 seconds before the guards burst through that door. Then we wait for the shift change." Paul said. "Tonight, we turn this cage into a broadcast tower." The night in the Vanguard facility was artificial, marked only by the dimming of the corridor lights and the silent rotation of security cameras. Inside the observation suite, the air was stagnant. Paul stood by the heavy steel door, his ear pressed against the cold metal, listening for the rhythmic footsteps of the corridor patrol. "Now," Paul whispered. David knelt in front of the smart fridge. The portable drive connected to its service port via a makeshift cable he'd fashioned from a dismantled lamp cord. His face was illuminated by the blue glow of the interface. Sarah stood behind him, her hands clenched. "I've bypassed the user interface," David muttered, his fingers flying across the touchscreen. "I'm in the facility's subnet. It's an old-school architecture, high security on the outside. But once you're in, the nodes trust each other. I'm tunneling into the primary server rack in the basement." The logic of the dead man's switch was a masterpiece of digital insurance. David wasn't just uploading the data, he was fragmenting it across the facility's local backup drives. If a specific heartbeat signal, a code he would enter every 6 hours, wasn't received, the fragments would automatically reassemble and broadcast to every major news outlet and university server on the planet. "The upload is starting," David said, his voice tight. "The bandwidth spike is going to be massive. The AI will see a data surge of roughly 50 gigabits per second. Here we go." A progress bar appeared on the fridge screen. 0%, 10%, 25%. Suddenly, the red emergency lights in the room began to pulse. A low-frequency klaxon groaned through the walls. "They've flagged it," Paul said, his hand tightening on a heavy metal chair leg he'd broken off earlier. "David, how much longer?" 40 seconds. "The alien data structure is resisting the compression. It's too complex." Outside, the sound of heavy boots echoed in the hallway. The guards were coming. "We need more time," Sarah cried. She ran to the door and began shouting, "Help! He's having a seizure. The mechanic is dying." The heavy door's lock hissed. The steel slab slid open, and 3 guards in full tactical gear burst in, their rifles raised. The lead guard took one look at David huddled over the fridge and realized it wasn't a medical emergency. "Step away from the terminal," the guard roared. "Keep going, David," Paul yelled. He swung the chair leg, catching the lead guard's rifle and knocking it off target. The room exploded into chaos. Paul used his weight to tackle the second guard, while Sarah threw a heavy blanket over the third. 75%, 85%, 95%. "Done," David screamed, slamming his palm against the screen. "The ghost is in the machine." The guards regained their footing, pinning Paul and David against the wall. A moment later, the door opened again. It wasn't Director Holloway. It was a man in a lab coat, his face pale as he looked at a tablet in his hand. "Stop," the man ordered the guards. He looked at Paul with a mixture of terror and respect. "What have you done?" "The system is locked. We can't delete the packets. They're everywhere, the security grid, the climate control, the satellite uplink. It's a dead man's switch," Paul said, wiping a streak of blood from his lip. He smiled, though his body ached. "You want the library? You can have it. But if we don't check in every 6 hours, the whole world gets a copy. You can't kill us, and you can't let us out of your sight. We just became the most important people on Earth." The man in the lab coat looked at the screen of his tablet, then back at the prisoners. The power dynamic of the facility had shifted in 90 seconds. They were no longer captives. They were the trigger. 6 months had passed since the Alethea vanished into a pillar of green light. The world had not ended, but it had begun to tilt on its axis. Paul Vance sat on the balcony of a secluded villa in the Azores, the salt air of the Atlantic a constant reminder of the depth he had escaped. He wasn't a prisoner anymore, at least not in the traditional sense. He was a consultant to the Global Transition Council, a fancy title for a man holding a gun to the head of the status quo. The dead man's switch remained active. Every 6 hours, Paul, David, or Sarah entered a randomized 64-character biometric key into a satellite-linked terminal. If the heartbeat ever stopped, the full, unencrypted biological and physical library of the shadows would flood the internet. "The latest batch went out this morning," Sarah said, stepping onto the balcony. She looked healthier, the haunted look in her eyes replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. "The propulsion physics. We're already seeing labs in Switzerland and Japan replicating the magneto-hydrodynamic drive." "And the biologicals?" Paul asked. "The Great Catalogue is being released to the WHO and major universities first," she replied. "We're calling it the Resurrection Protocol. It's not just DNA. It's the chemical environment needed to rebuild ecosystems. We're fixing the oceans." Paul, sector by sector. The slow leak strategy was working. By releasing the information in controlled, digestible increments, they had avoided a global panic or a world war over the technology. It was a delicate balance of power, managed by a table of truth thresholds. Paul looked out at the water. The Vanguard Group had been dismantled, its assets absorbed by a multinational oversight body. Miller had taken a plea deal and moved to a small island in the Pacific, far from any deep-sea installations. David was the head of the new archive project, spending his days translating the nonlinear alien code into human mathematics. The physics of the transition was complex, but it followed a simple law of entropy. As knowledge increased, the chaos of the old world decreased. Paul often thought of the truth equation they had derived from the library's introduction. As the sun began to set, the ocean surface turned a deep, bruised purple. Paul noticed a familiar shimmering in the water, a faint, bioluminescent green glow, miles out at the edge of the shelf. He didn't feel afraid. He knew the shadows were still there, watching from the trenches, waiting to see if their library would be used to build a future or merely a better weapon. The golden box was gone, the station was a memory, and the Aletheia was a ghost. But as Paul looked up at the stars, he realized they weren't just lights in the sky anymore. They were destinations. Humanity had been given the keys to the cellar, and in doing so, they had finally been allowed to look at the roof. 6 hours are almost up, Sarah said, nodding toward the terminal inside. Paul stood, his legs steady. He walked to the machine, placed his hand on the scanner, and entered the code. The heartbeat pulsed, the signal went out, and the world kept turning, smarter, stranger, and finally, for the first time in history, truly aware of its place in the dark.